Hello and good evening. I'm Al, and today I have a special treat for you. I brought in a top-notch guest, and our topic today is the English Reformation, and our guest is Ryan Grant from Mediatrix Press. How are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing well, and yourself?
I'm doing quite well.
All
I'm
right. Thanks
really
for having
looking
me.
forward to this. I've got a lot of Anglican friends, actually. A few Anglican,
Mhm.
a friend who's an Anglican priest, a guy who's a online apologist. So hopefully they get to see this eventually. So Ryan, I'll ask the same question I ask all my guests who come on for the first time. Tell us how you came to know the Lord Jesus Christ and end up in the church you're in.
Well, it was um, actually, ironically, I was baptized Episcopalian,
Oh wow!
um, and unless I'm mistaken, is the oldest Episcopal church in this country, St. Peter's in Hebron, Connecticut,
Oh
and
wow!
it. Let's see. We stopped going to church when I was very little, and to the point where I had zero memory of it. And I was raised largely agnostic. I didn't know anything about, the church or Christ or what any of it meant, even though I heard references to it here and there. And then I can't remember exactly when. There's like a point in when I was young where my mother started when my mother's side of the family. My mother's side is Jewish, and so she was raised as an Orthodox Jew. Converted to the faith because there was a schism in the family. There was one of her relatives married an Italian Catholic and
Ooh.
caused war because back in those days, I mean, it was war. And then so she just was curious and went to mass with a relative. And this is before Vatican II, and she was sold. She became Catholic. But then Vatican II happened, and then she went to Woodstock instead. So, or something like that. I don't know.
Ooh.
I have no idea if that story is true, but she mentioned that. My mother died just recently this year, so if you pray for her soul, she did revert to the faith. Thanks be to God. But and actually, that's the reason that I'm Catholic. But in the meantime, she she started taking us to the synagogue when we'd see our relatives, and that was kind of the first notion of any kind of religious identity for me was being Jewish, because you just observe, and I didn't know anything about it except Hebrew prayers that I didn't understand. And we wore I called them the funny hats, and then I called it yarmulke, like the instrument yarmulke. But so I had one of those and didn't know what any of it meant. I just knew there were pastries and rye bread afterwards, so we're fine, I guess, as far as I knew. Little did I know, participating in non-Catholic rites as a baptized individual, had no idea that this was the case. So because I didn't know anything better. But
Yeah, that's true.
so my great grandmother was kind of the reason why that side of the family continued with Orthodox Jewry, because they were all mostly atheists. And when she died, everyone more or less stopped practicing. And so the Jewish life that I had known on some portions of any given month ceased to exist. And it kind of went back to normalcy. Didn't
Agnostic.
really affect me. Back to de facto agnostic, not formally agnostic. There was just a vacuum. There was just nothing. And then sometime, I think when I hit my teenage years, I wanted to know something. I put it this way. I said, "Hey, Mom, I got to know something about this Jesus guy. I got to know what this," because hitherto, I had thought the name of our Lord was a cuss word, because you got smacked the same way when you said other bad words.
Yeah.
And so I had no frame of reference, no knowledge, no way to understand what the faith was about. It just wasn't something that was given. So we went back to the Episcopal Church where I'd been baptized. I always like to joke in light of more recent scandals that I know my baptism is valid because it was Episcopal and not in the certain more progressive churches in the Novus Ordo. So,
Well, just let me ask them for a second. Like you talked about how your mom was a Jew, but you got baptized Episcopalian. I take it that was from your father.
well, it was a mix. So, as my mom had become Catholic, lapsed in the faith, but still, had an abiding belief, like people do when they've left formal practice of religion. There's still the sensibilities there. So her sensibilities were Jewish and Christian, basically. My dad was a divorced Protestant, And rather than, thought the church was meddling too much into their private business, but with the annulment process, so they said, well, why don't we just go Episcopalian? I mean, it's like same thing, a little more progressive. The church will get there eventually. So that's what they did. And my dad, that was acceptable. My dad, who was a Protestant, still is actually. And they, so they got married in the Episcopal Church, and that's why I was baptized there. And so essentially, and that's why we went back there. And then I started, kind of learning about the faith through them. And they actually had this children's Bible, which actually I don't know what it was. I wish I knew the edition, because it was actually a really good children's Bible. It didn't get into any kind of Protestant-y type of doctrines. It didn't have any kind of attacks on Catholicism. It just merely presented the scriptural stories. And so as a result, I knew the Bible pretty well through this children's Bible, at least the substance of it.
Amen.
Long before I'd actually taken the time to carefully study it with exegetes and whatnot. I found I had a frame of reference to understand things that otherwise I would not have, thanks to this particular children's Bible. Didn't get much of it in preaching or anything. But it's funny, too, with this Episcopal Church, is that up until probably sometime when it was only a few years before we started going back that they changed this. The minister used to face the altar, and
Wow.
they still, when I was there, gave communion, their bread on an altar rail. and they at least at the time that I was going there, they kept that up. But anyway, my mother then was watching, I think, EWTN. She was watching Mother Angelica. And she has this desire to receive the Holy Eucharist, to get back into the Catholic Church. So she, went down to the cathedral in Norwich, Connecticut, talked to one of the priests, who actually met a really good and faithful priest who helped her work on that process of reconciliation and coming back in the church. And then shortly after she did that, she made my brother and I do it, and we didn't really know why. And it's like, okay, we're Catholic now. And I kind of didn't know much about it. Said, all right, cool. But then right off the bat, it's kind of a funny thing. So now I was Catholic without really knowing much about the faith. And the first thing that I noticed is that my mother was trying to tell me that the communion was actually Christ's body and blood. And I had a hard time believing it because of this very thing. When we were at the Episcopal Church, we knelt at an altar rail for bread. But now we were expected to walk in a big line and put out our hands to receive. I was like, well, wait a minute. If that was God, wouldn't we do like we did to the other church? That just makes more sense. And so
the bread has more reverence than
yes.
Almighty God.
The first couple of years, I didn't believe in the Eucharist for that reason, because the praxis wasn't matching up. And then this same priest that brought my mother in the faith preached on it, and I was like, okay, I guess I was wrong about that, and I accepted it, and made sense. Still young, still kind of working all this stuff out. And it wasn't until I think I went to college I got really serious about learning about the faith. And even then, I had so many abominable notions, poor public school training, all kinds of absurd and immature behavior in college and whatnot. But gradually I persevered through, and thought I had a call to the priesthood. So I really bulked up in the study of theology and philosophy. I didn't, obviously, as I eventually discovered, discerning whether I had a vocation or not. And learned Latin, because Latin was necessary to do theology right, frankly. And that's
translate this.
Yeah, that was later. That was they needed a job, so I needed money. So, but actually, it worked out. It was meant to be a side project. It wasn't meant to be the thing that runs everything, but that's exactly what it does now. So, I mean, praise God for that.
Praise God. Okay. And just one more thing before we move on to the next part. You mentioned Connecticut. Is that where you're from?
That's where I'm from originally.
Okay, because I know you, like, I don't want to say where you live unless you're comfortable with it, but yeah.
That's not where I live now. Now I live in North Idaho.
Idaho, okay. That's not that far from where I am. I can get to Idaho in about 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I can get to the panhandle of Idaho. I'm in Calgary.
And that's Canada. And the panhandle would only be about an hour and a half further from Bouts, where I live.
Okay. And have you ever been up to Canada, up to BC, Alberta?
Not to Alberta. Back about 25 years ago, I was in Niagara, because then I was on the other side of the country. So
yeah, Ontario, yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, now you did bring this up a second ago. Your translating project and your publishing outfit. Tell us about your publishing outfit, and you mentioned you got a couple books coming out that people might be interested in.
So the publishing was so Mediatrix Press, www.mediatrixpress.com.
It's in the description.
Yeah, and so that was born out. I was working as a teacher. I taught Latin for a number of years, and the school was cutting back. The headmaster and he was French. We didn't quite get on, and so it was time for me to move on. And then I was looking for other things and other projects, and actually, it was Father Rippiger who told me, "Hey, look, you can produce books on print on demand, make a tidy side income that way." And he was showing me how it worked. And I was like, "Oh, that's phenomenal! There's tons of books I want to get back into print." And so I started getting into that, studying that in the course where I had to learn copyright law very extensively. That took a while, and other things. But it's like, wow, this would be a great side income. But there was a downturn in the economy at the time, and it was actually becoming extremely difficult for me to find employment. And I found a bunch of side gigs that all together kind of worked. But so it forced me to put the labor in to make Mediatrix Press kind of the main income. I had a gig where I worked for TAN for a while, and that helped during that process. And during COVID, I got furloughed from them during COVID. And then after that, I got in. But yeah, in the process of trying to build the press, I said, all right, I was reprinting some books, trying to find new books to reprint, trying to find something that's going to be unique, it's going to be interesting. And I kept looking, what can I do? What can I do that's going to be really good for this? And then I had sat down with a fraternity priest who didn't know Latin well enough to read Bellarmine, and he wanted to know what Bellarmine had thought on a couple of subjects. One on that, of course, obviously, had that question of the Pope in Book 2, Chapter 30, which is my least favorite question right now. It's the least thing I want to deal with. But anyway, just because there's so many people get in on it that don't have the knowledge on every side of that question. And then, so that the people who do, again, on every side of that question, because there are sedficantists that do have the knowledge about what's going on there. And then there's a lot of posers that don't, and everyone wants to argue that question and debate and cite it, and they usually don't know the frame of debate and reference. And so it gets frustrating. It's like, I'm just done with that whole question.
I've never come across them before. No, obviously.
But on every side, it's not just, it's just certain sedficantists, certain people in whatever camp you want to call it, traditionalists or neoconservatives or liberal, they get in and start talking about that. And it's like, and I've been through that text so many times in corresponding texts and other theologians. I'm just not I'm zapped out on that whole question. But nevertheless, so he was, so I was explaining it to him and breaking down the Latin. I was like, it's a shame. Nobody ever translated this, right? So that stuck in my head in a couple of years. And so as I'm now reprinting books, I'd come across this short treatise from St. Peter Canisius. And I published that, A Small Catechism for Catholics. And I saw it was like 90 pages in the original or something like that. And I said, I bet I could do this in about 2 weeks. So I sat down and I had like a Google Books version of it, and it was just translating there. Got someone to pick up the editing on it. And then as I went through it, I was like, that actually wasn't that hard. Maybe the way to make some money here is to do Bellarmine, since it's nobody else is doing. Now, little did I know, Father Kenneth Baker was also working on Bellarmine. And had I known that, I probably would have stayed, let him do it, because he would have done it a lot faster than I can, because he's a retired priest and he doesn't have children. And at the time, my late wife and everything and things to provide for. So he's got the time to do all this. It probably would have been smarter. But say, Olivia, here we are. And it's glad I did it. I did do the very first translation of his treatise on the Pope to make it into print in English. And although I'm actually slightly embarrassed by that thing, because I couldn't get the editing done and I needed to get some money back out of it. So I just went ahead and put forth the first half of it into print ill-advisedly. And it was a mess editing wise. Cleaned it up subsequently. There's still things to fix in it, but for the most part, it's serviceable now. But anyway, that's kind of how that developed. And so, and then it's like just continuing on translating as well as reprint. Not everything we publish is something I've translated. There's a lot of things I just reprint, saints nobody's ever heard of before, and we put them out there. And if you browse through our catalog, you'll see, wow, I never heard of that saint before. Or you might have heard about the saint, but you didn't know anything about them, and here's a whole book on them. And so, and I tend to gravitate to books that are historically viable as biographies. So they're not, but they're written by Catholics from a Catholic perspective, so that it's kind of try to diminish the faith like a secular author would, but it's also not a hagiography relating every fabulous story that may or may not be associated with this or that saint. So that's kind of what I gravitate to in terms of lives of saints and whatnot. But so the Bellarmine, stuff, I've still got a lot more to get done on that, and I've been, busy with different things. But now that's my sole income, and it's actually providing for 7 kids, a mortgage, and everything else. And so, thanks be to God. And so, and actually, it's fortuitous we're talking about this tonight because I'm about to send to the printers, although a little bit late. I meant to have it done last week, but the very first English translation of St. John Fisher's treatise against one of his treatises against Luther, which is defense of Henry's book on the 7 sacraments, and response to Luther's response to Henry. We'll talk about that a bit tonight.
Is that against Luther's Babylonian captivity by St. John Fisher?
Right. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat so everyone can go purchase it and go purchase that book. I'm going to purchase it. I can't wait.
Yeah, it's a pre-order right now. But I should have, if I can get that to the printer tonight, I should be sitting on copies by next weekend.
Okay. Okay, so we're here to talk about the English Reformation. I'm sure John Fisher will come up. So, and this is particular interest to me. Like I got an Anglican priest friend. I know some Anglicans, but also both of us, both me and you, come from countries that were former English colonies. Like I know Canada is kind of a binational English-French, but I'm from the English portion. I speak French, but I'm from the English part. You're from an English colony, and so it's part of our history how this happened, and technically what happened. Like I suppose colonialism was kind of in its infancy at that time. At the time of the Reformation in England, but so just take it away. I'll let you get started. The English Reformation, all yours, Ryan.
Okay. Well, the English Reformation is interesting for the reason that it's unexpected. You would never imagine it to come about. Looking at the events from, say, 1509 moving forward, you would never expect anything like it to happen. And even further, as far as countries and clerical corruption go, England was one of the least corrupt. Maybe Spain would be the outlier that would be even less corrupt than problems in England. That doesn't mean there were no problems, but you didn't see anything like you saw on the continent in terms of, with bishops. You had a good deal of absenteeism, which was the scourge of that period, that is, bishops were not in their dioceses, but you didn't have anything like you had in the corruption, the major episcopal scandals, and things of that sort. And even doings of Renaissance popes are a bit of kind of fabulous narrative from somewhere else, and kind of restricted in knowledge to the elite and everything. So the idea that eventually England would kind of go on with the Reformation, nobody would have figured. So, and it starts out, you start with Henry VIII, and Henry VIII, this is the part of Henry VIII's reign that nobody really knows about. He's young, he's pious, he's handsome, he's thin, by the way. The weight comes on much, much later. And in
just like William the Conqueror, that happened with him too. Yeah. He became fat at the end of his life.
Mm-hmm. But, 1512, Henry goes to war in France on a papal crusade for the Pope against the King of France. And what had happened is that through with the reigniting of the Italian wars and everything, the French king tried to have Julius II deposed by setting up a false council in Pisa. And so it tried to go right back to what they did during Western Schism, try to depose
a great Western Schism,
a new pope that would be more amenable to French interests. And so the Pope excommunicated the King of France and basically called a crusade, if you will, not quite using those terms, but the League of Cambrai, refashioned, whereas originally a league against Venice. Now the Venetians have come hat in hand, joined up with the Empire, and now England and Spain against France. And Louis XII was the monarch there. So Henry goes to war against Louis XII for the Pope under a papal banner, right? And he everything, he's always looking to support the interests of the church. And you'd never expect that there was anything, in his future, like what would actually happen. So the conclusion of the war is, of course, it's beyond England's resources to actually fight a war in France. This is not the 100 Years' War. The French, is far too large a country, England far too small, and Henry's resources, great as they were, far too limited. He takes Toulon and Tarouane, these two cities, and he intends to keep a permanent English presence there, but it becomes so brutally expensive. On top of that, the Spanish don't actually show themselves to be particularly trustworthy allies. Ferdinand promises the moon to Henry, and on top of that, he still hadn't finished paying off Catherine's dowry from Arthur's wedding, let alone Henry's. And so he, promises all this money and help. And in the end, he gets in the field. He fights the French in the Pyrenees. He takes Nevers into Spanish territory. And he just kind of dithers off to whatever he wants to do, and leaves Henry alone in northern France, saying, "Hey, you were supposed to help me. What about dismembering France and taking huge swaths of it? Yeah, whoops, not so much anymore." So Henry gets pissed off. On top of that, although Catherine was pregnant again, she had been pregnant with a son that was born, also named Henry, in 1511. Henry goes to Walsingham to give thanks to the Blessed Virgin. And on his way back, messengers meet him to tell him that his son had died.
Oh, no.
And so it died 3 weeks after birth. And Henry's an interesting character. As a psychological case study, is very interesting. He is the kind of guy, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And he treats heaven the same way he treats subjects and whatever. So the Blessed Virgin had not rewarded him for his pilgrimage to Walsingham and everything. So his devotion to the Blessed Virgin just drops right off after that. He finds a new saint to give royal patronage to. There'll be no more pilgrimages to Walsingham after that. And so, everything for Henry is very self-centered, very much to his appetites and the things he wants, right? And so in the same way with his wife, he's always going to be very generous and kind to his wife for the most part. But when things aren't working out in his favor, he's going to get very upset and start moving in a different direction. So Catherine miscarries after this whole bit with her father not doing anything useful or particularly helpful in terms of the English alliance, not fulfilling his end of the bargain. So Henry's like, you know what? Once Louis XII had reconciled with Rome, and so his excommunication was lifted. So Henry decides an alliance with the French now, and so he has to withdraw from his English possessions back to Calais. But he marries his sister, Mary Tudor, not the same as his daughter, to Louis XII. And so Catherine's just like, you're allying with my enemy, and he's like, well, yeah, your dad didn't do much for me, but that ends.
Well, just pause for a second. And during this time, I could be wrong. You would know, but during this whole time, wasn't there an invade? He's on the continent in France doing his stuff. There's a war with Scotland, and Catherine of Aragon gets kind of involved in that.
James IV of Scotland, actually really fascinating king in terms of bringing in the Renaissance ideals of kingship and culture into Scotland, or the flowering attempt at this cut short. He actually takes advantage of Henry being out of the country to invade. So Catherine organizes the war effort, and she, gets the troops in the field. And at the Battle of Flodden, James IV gets cut down. I don't remember the specifics in that battle. Normally, I'm pretty up on the military history. I actually forget the specifics in that particular battle. There's a bit of an accident there, but James IV then is captured and killed. So, of course, Catherine actually has a larger victory to her credit. The Duke of Surrey, Henry's friend, having brought about the killer blow on James and IV, and then bringing his coat of arms and regalia back, in triumph back to London. So, so that had happened, and that actually sets into motion dangerous, the troubled future for Mary, the Queen of Scots, through that destruction of a lot of Scotland's leading nobility at that point. And I could go, it could go into that. It'll take us a bit far afield. So, but that does happen around the same time of 1513. So Henry comes back. He has this short alliance with France. That, when Louis XII then dies, reportedly paying a little too much attention sexually to his young wife, and so has a heart attack and dies. The next king of France is the Count of Angoulême, who takes the name Francois I, and he unites all the disparate factions of the French nobility under him, so that France is now unified and pretty much in England now, completely out of England's league. And so Henry had declared years earlier that under Louis XII, before this little alliance, right, when he had conquered the French at Terouanne, he says, if the King of France wishes to go to Italy, he will, if I say, and if I say nay, he shall stay. Well, Francois calls Henry's bluff and says, well, I'm going to Italy, let Harry do something about it. And of course, Henry didn't have the troops or the resources to do anything about it. And so Francois then soundly defeats Julius II at the Battle of Ravenna. And he gets a little arrangement where he's allowed to take tithes and taxes on the church with papal approval. And the benefit, as well as hold church property, in possession of the monarchy. So the benefit to this is that when the Reformation really gets into full swing about a decade later, and you have, you're in Germany where everyone's, plundered church land and everything, right? And Calvin makes his appeal in the 1530s to Francois to accept the Reformed religion. There's no financial benefit for Francois because he already owns all the church property. He already has the tithes and the money. So there's no benefit to him to accept the Reformation. So he rejects and hangs a lot of the ruffians from the affair of the placards and whatnot. And so there's just no reason for him to go that way. But that's the long-term, consequence of that. So, Henry's been upstaged by this younger, taller, more handsome king that also is bringing in Renaissance and the new learning and stuff into France. Francois I's court will bring in a lot of Italian artists, especially the ones of a more criminal character like a Cellini. Cellini was a goldsmith, really famous one, brilliant artisan. Really big scoundrel, horrible man, is wanted locally in the Papal States for rape and 2 murders. And Vinci was being investigated for pedophilia potentially by the Podesta in Florence, and he was known to swing bisexually. Whether or not he'd actually done that's another question, but that's what the Podesta was looking into. So he fled Florence, and Francois's basic policy was, well, hey, all you guys, as long as you're behaved up here, you'll have all the royal patronage you could ever want. And so as far as we know from the French records, Da Vinci was very well behaved in Paris, and likewise Cellini and others. But that's how the Mona Lisa, that's why the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre and not in some museum in Italy, by the way. In case anyone
I never thought of that.
Yeah, because Francois brings him in. Another consequence of all this too. So, and this is again for the future, a little tangent, but it's worthwhile. So I mentioned Ferdinand had taken the Pyrenees away from the French. This means the Kingdom of Navarre. He had taken this away from the French, and in that is the Basque region with its capital at Pamplona, right? And so about 10 years later, Henry will ally with the Emperor Charles V and be at war with the French, and the Spanish are unhappy with Charles V, so they revolt. And they try, they realize Spanish Navarre is heavily under-garrisoned, perfect place to start an uprising. And so they basically tell the Basques, hey, if you want to revolt, no one from Spain is going to stop you. And so they invite Francois I to come in, the French to come in and help them. And Francois was like, hey, kick Charles while he's down. That sounds great to me. So he sends troops into Navarre. And so the Spanish garrison in Navarre that's loyal to the king, they're outnumbered. And and so they're going to quit. But then there's a captain, Inigo. Inigo Montoya, you killed my father. No, not that Inigo. If you've seen The Princess Bride, if you haven't, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So anyway, he brings up the morale and he says, no, we're going to fight. We're not going to run before these French bastards. We're going to make our stand here. So he does. very heroically. And the French are rather surprised. They didn't think the place could hold out for a day, and holds out for 3. But then Inigo is cut down by a cannonball, smashes some ramparts nearby, and all the debris smashes one of his legs, and a bullet goes through his other leg. And so he's down for the count. The morale drops. The garrison surrenders. But the French are so impressed with his bravery, they let him go, because he's also a Basque. They let him go back to his ancestral house in Loyola. And now you know the rest of the story, as they say. And so he goes on to become St. Ignatius of Loyola. And all that comes about through all these political machinations between Henry VIII and Francois I and Charles V, always stabbing each other in the back.
And that was in 1521. I know that because I read around the time Pope Francis was actually getting elected Pope. I was reading Father Ginelli, I think it's Ginelli, the biography of Saint Ignatius. So
right,
yeah. So yeah, no, it's good. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So anyway, so back to England. So Henry, war hasn't worked out very well for him. So he's looking for ways to get back into the limelight somehow. And he, then, proceeds to try to set up this peace conference with the French. Meanwhile, an ill wind is blowing out of Germany. So you get Luther. And so you have of course, the year story, 31st October, 1517. Luther heroically goes down to challenge the abuses of Rome and nails this 95 Thesis to the doors of the cathedral in this act of defiance. It's all BS. None of that actually happened. It makes for fun every 31st October when the Protestants want to get out and celebrate Reformation Day. But if you took a time machine and you say you got the DeLorean time machine from Back to the Future, and you set it to go back to 31st October 1517, and you're sitting outside the doors in Wittenberg, outside the cathedral doors, and you're just looking around. Okay, I'll chill out here and waiting. And you see some people coming out from Mass because it's the Vigil of All Saints. And so, right, it's a fast day. People are getting provisions in the marketplace and whatnot, and they're busy and moving around. Because All Saints Day is the next day, and big celebrations are planned and everything. And you're like, when is this going to happen? It's days getting on here, and you see the sun going down. It's would have been about 5:30. It started getting dark, and you're like, well, what's going on here? When's the Reformation Day supposed to happen? And then you see, clerk coming on down, from the university with a bunch of scrolls rolled up in one arm and a bucket he's holding in the other, and he'd stop in front of the cathedral doors, paste this glue on the cathedral doors. You didn't actually nail them because cathedral doors are bulletin boards, essentially. That's the one place everyone could be expected to be sometime during the week. And you can't nail into the doors because you're going to destroy them. But you can paste on them every once in a while. You can scrape it all up, do a layer of varnish on it, make the doors look pretty again, and every so many years, and do it again. And so, he puts this glue up, and it'd be putting up these papers and setting all these things out to see, right? And then walk off. And you're like, was that it? And you walk up there, and bunch of documents in Latin. And one of them would have been a public disputation on 95 theses of discussion on indulgences by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther of the Friars of St. Augustine. That's what you would have seen. And of course, it would have been in Latin. So if you didn't know Latin, you couldn't have read it. Neither could anybody else.
Now, the thing is, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I've read quite a few of Martin Luther's early tracts. It sounds like he was saying more controversial stuff in September, because in September he was doing, he had something similar to that called the Disputation of Scholastic Theology, and I think that was a lot more controversial than the 95 Theses.
Yeah, much more so.
But for some reason, the 95 Theses became popular, and there's some people who think he may have come with his justification by faith alone a couple years earlier.
Much earlier. That's a certainty. The reason we know that wasn't discovered until the late 19th century, but Luther's lecture notes were discovered. And his lecture notes on Romans that he was giving in 1512. So a full 5 years before the 95 Thesis and everything. And there you can see in his notes, he's already on faith alone. He's already on denial of free will, even. He's already on questioning the authority of councils and other things. It's already there. in his lecture notes. So he was already on that point when he's lecturing on Romans at the University of Erfurt. And so this is not really, if we're going to summarize Luther properly, Luther uses the abuses in the church, which were true abuses and truly bad, as a cover for pushing his new doctrines, basically.
That does make sense, because his big issue was the sale of indulgences. But I mean, okay, clean up the abuse and just go on. There's all this other theology which has nothing to do with the abuses.
Yeah. Luther has not a word to say about relics. Why does he have nothing to say about relics? Because his political protector, Frederick the Wise, makes a killing off this relic church he has in.
He got like 10,000 relics.
In Wittenberg, yeah, thousands and thousands upon relics, and he pay money, go in pilgrimage there and donate and whatever. He gets tons of money out of that. So Luther has not a word to say about relics until Frederick the Wise is passed on to his eternal reward. So. But anyway, so why is it that the indulgences thing really catches on, but his rejection? So the rejection, the attack on scholastic theology is not unique or new to Luther. It's something that's largely like an in-house debate amongst the intellectuals of that period. And so you see this especially with Erasmus of Rotterdam.
Right.
Humanism. And so humanism did not universally reject the scholastics, but some humanists did. So you look at somebody like Erasmus of Rotterdam, really fascinating character, very close friend of St. Thomas More, as well as of St. John Fisher, and many other intellectuals of the time on various sides of various questions. Erasmus is a really complicated figure. I could do a whole podcast on Erasmus. We don't have the time, but to summarize it quickly, he's a guy who shouldn't exist. He's the son of a priest. So he's sent off to a monastery, like you do with sons of priests that aren't supposed to be there. And he is, educated fairly well. He decides to get out of the monastery. He works just simply on devoting himself to Latin letters, becomes a committed humanist. And so in the course of his writing and training, I mean, he's doing a lot of work recovering the sources. So it's somewhat analogous to the ressourcement movement that you see with the Danulus and
that's what I was thinking.
Angars and de Lubac, right in the earlier part of the 20th century, and in the whole idea of ressourcement in the 16th century, you called it ad fontes, and it's ultimately the same thing, going back to the sources, right? Except that you're not just going back to the sources. Going back to the sources is more or less a cover for rejecting the things you don't like that came before, or recasting them into a new image that sounds good, but may not actually be good. So in Erasmus's case, it's like a lot of the humanists questioning, prevailing things in the church, like penance, for example. Luigi Valla. No, sorry, not Luigi. I would say Luigi. Lorenzo Valla. Come on, get it right. Lorenzo Valla is an Italian humanist, one of the many humanist disciples of Petrarch.
I was going to say he was the one who debunked the what's the name of that document?
The donation of confidence. Yeah. And he's not the only one. Other people had attacked it before him, but he does the final debunking of that document. Right. Excellent work. Nothing. I have no opposition to anything he says in the declamation of the false donation of Constantine and whatnot. But what he does, then he goes in other places. You say, well, look, in the original Greek, it doesn't say go and do penance in the scripture where Christ tells someone go and do penance. He says, well, the penitentiary in Latin, the Greek word just says turn your life around. It doesn't say do penance, and that was taken as a text as a justification for the church's system of penance. So what they do is then attack the notion of giving penances, of temporal satisfaction for sin, and other things that are absolutely a part of formal Catholic teaching, on the basis of going back to the sources. And you see de Lubac and von Balthasar do exactly the same type of things. You look at de Lubac. Well, the church, these formal doctrines and determinations, they say this. But then here's this one, obiter dicta from some Greek father. He says this, so we don't really know. But no, that doesn't follow, actually. That's another way. And that kind of nonsense is the same thing going on in the 16th century with various humanists. So Erasmus is very much like that. He hates all the scholastics. He wants them all thrown out. He thinks that you should only go back to the church fathers and primarily Origen as the chief of them. And that's who thinks that you should be, how you should be doing things. Now, there's a divine at Leuven named Laudamus. And Laudamus also fairly well learned in what we call the New Learning. But he's not a humanist, properly speaking. He's a scholastic, but he's actually done the reading, and he's also very well versed in the Church Fathers. And so he debates Erasmus in pamphlets. He invites Erasmus to come debate in person. Erasmus won't show up. And so Laodimus debates in pamphlets saying, well, you can't throw out the scholastics. Yes, we read the Church Fathers too, buddy. You're not the only one here. You don't have the, this isn't like your intellectual property or anything. I mean, he doesn't use those terms in some way, but but you can't throw out the scholastics because they continued the work of the Church Fathers, and they labored on problems that had not even presented themselves in the Church Fathers' day. And so therefore you can't throw them out, and he and Erasmus get in a very bitter, acrimonious thing. And of course, Laodimus's idea is no, St. Augustine should be the chief of the fathers we study. And he's largely responsible for setting up the cult of St. Augustine that you have at Leuven, which will feature very prominently when you get to Jansenism and other things that we won't talk about today. That's a tangent I'm walking away from. But they generally say, go ahead. So they say that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Erasmus very much hated that. A lot of his defenders, like More, very much hated that saying, but there's a truth in it. As much as Erasmus tried to distance himself from Luther at various points, the reality was that the way he took like people like Lorenzo Valla and various other Italian humanists and popularized them in the rest of the continent and followed their model and method in assaulting traditional things in the church. And that doesn't mean every single thing was absolutely 100% like the Vulgate. Did have certain ways of rendering the original Hebrew that weren't, that gave a questionable character to the actual events. Like, well, the whole thing, like you see all the artwork with Moses, and Moses has horns, and it was the expression that Jerome uses in the Vulgate was not properly understood through the Middle Ages, and so. The use of horns is referencing power, like the energy that could be seen kind of flowing from Moses, and that's what the Hebrew is getting at. And so, but Jerome uses that word cornu, and so the medievals take it very literally, and they think Moses really has horns. And so they say, well, Bible says, so we're going to depict him with horns. And so you have all these medieval pictures and even late, Renaissance statues of Moses that have these horns going on, and that's why, right? And so, I mean, text criticism, there's no reason why you can't look back and challenge that and say, no, that's not what was really going on here. That's not the problem. The problem with some, Erasmus questioning, throwing out the scholastics, questioning this, you're basically undercutting the means whereby the Holy Spirit is assisting the church through one of her organs of teaching is through theologians, right? And, theologians connected with the church through the bond of unity throughout all time. That's why, it's Pius IX taught in Tuus Libenter that when the theologians, he met with a very specific term, a very specialized term of theologos, that is those theologians that constituted in the schools under their bishops with authority, when they're unanimous on a given question during those periods where the schools were independent of the state and free, those their teaching should be considered infallible. And that's what Pius IX lays down. And part of the common consensus teaching of theologians are carrying on the work of the Church Fathers again. So Luther, he gets into that debate and he's following the modern opinion, especially because he hates most of the scholastics, especially St. Thomas. He takes on a very big hatred for St. Thomas for some reason. And it really manifests itself in his response to Henry VIII, where he's really just laying on against Thomas. He makes verbs out of it to Thomisticate, Thomisticare, he puts it in this Latin verb he creates, basically synonymous with, coming up with a whole bunch of nonsense, right? Meaning sophism. And that's the view Luther takes. And so, but that's like an in-house thing for academics. That doesn't hit the popular threat. Indulgences, on the other hand, suppose that you heard Tetzel, and what happens is that the main objective of Renaissance popes, and especially Julius II, Leo X, first Medici pope, is to make money. You got to pay for this new St. Peter's. We got to pay for all these wars in central Italy to recover papal territory that was lost during the Western Schism from all these petty warlords. We got to pay armies for that. We got to pay Michelangelo. We got to pay Raphael. You got to pay for all this stuff. We want to make Rome better than Florence and even more splendorous and glorious, and that costs money. And there's just not enough. Free, So art is not free. That's for sure. Ars gratia artis. Well, but it's not free. The gratia there means for the sake of, it doesn't mean free. So you get into these problematic things where they need money. And so Julius II expands the bull on indulgences to cover, these papal permissions for indulgences to allow you to get money for various pious practices, to give indulgences. Like, you'll give so much money to the church, then you'll get this temporal remission for sins. And so let's backtrack just for a second in case anyone's confused about this. What is an indulgence? Well, it comes from the Latin word indulgentia, which means forgiveness or pardon. And the notion of indulgence is basically a pardon on the temporal punishment due to sin. So in the ancient church, you were really harsh penances. And it was sometime in the early Middle Ages that the church began to commute some of these really harsh penances. And so when you look at an old prayer book and it says indulgence of 100 days, a lot of people look at that and they think, 100 days off purgatory. That's not what it means, even though it seems like it does, but that's not it. What it actually means is the value of saying that prayer for 100 days. That's what it means. And by doing it, once with faith and charity, love of Christ, etc., not just writing it off by rote. Okay, I did this one check, but in the normal conditions of an indulgence, that you have true faith, true charity, and you say this prayer with devotion, then the temporal authority of the church commits the value of saying that prayer for 100 days by doing it once. Likewise, in the older forms, the indulgence was basically, going out on the street corner in sackcloth and ashes and asking mercy and pardon for your sins. Then doing that in this occasion will have the value of doing it for 3 months.
Okay, like Henry IV going to Canossa, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's pause for a sec. I kind of, so we're kind of around in the early 1520s. I don't know if you plan on covering up, but I think we should talk about it now. What was the role? Because I think you talked about 1512 when they found some of Martin Luther's notes on Sola Fide and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That's when, at the same time, they're doing the Fifth Lateran Council. Can you talk a tiny bit about that?
Just prior to Luther and the 95 Theses, they had done the Fifth Lateran Council, which does actually have a legitimate doctrinal contribution to the church, namely the condemnation of conciliarism. But as far as the reform agenda, so this is under Pope Leo X. It was called under Julius II, but it's carried out by Leo X, and he wanted to celebrate an ecumenical council to really be the crown of his papacy. It's poorly attended. A lot of kings are afraid of what reform means, because here's a part of the reality to it: abuses in the church. Most of half or more of the abuses of the church are actually abuses of the state and the wealthy and laity encroaching on the independence of the church. So, Episcopal absenteeism, why is that such a problem? Why are bishops not residing in their dioceses? Why are they all hanging out at the royal court looking for favors? Because the popes really didn't care who was appointed as a bishop, as long as they got the tax from it, the Inates tax. So king says, I want X person to be a bishop. Okay, done. And now we got this creature that is a creation of the king, and he is, or whatever the king's favorites that want this guy to be a bishop. He may or may not have the qualifications to be a bishop. Or he might be a canonist, but he's not a theologian. He might just be a churchman that has connections. Who knows? And so he's going to hang out at court and do political work for the king. Someone like Cardinal Wolsey is like this, for example, in England. And we'll get to him. And or again, the continent, you might see, for example, a very rich noble family like the Guise, for example, that would then have one of their younger relations at 3 years old consecrated as the abbot of some monastery, and all the ecclesiastical revenues now roll into the family. At 18, he resigns from the abbacy, is formally laicized, and goes and gets married, and keeps that money now in the family. And so you have, this is kind of repeated ad nauseum through Europe. And so the Pope's attempts to expand the indulgences are like, okay, man, you nobility, you're taking so much money away. I need to get the money from somewhere. And so you have that abuse of the indulgences, and then it's not properly preached. So the Pope dispatches Tetzel, who's German, to out into the Holy Roman Empire to preach indulgences, right? And some of his stuff is very close to Luther's thing. The coin goes in the can and the soul immediately flies out of purgatory and stuff like that. Yeah, things that are absolutely an affront to Orthodox Catholic theology on indulgences, right? It's not what we teach at all. But that's how it's getting preached. And so this is creating the popular indignation. So like I said, 95 Theses nailed to the walls, or the doors. It didn't happen. but it was posted. And 2 weeks later, Luther's students translated it into German. And that sets off that's how it takes. And that's how it sets off the big firestorm where Luther now becomes a celebrity of this angst against church corruption, which affects them closer in the pocket than, I mean, on top of that too, like you commission indulgence. And so in a moment of piety with somebody preaching, you'd give money over. And then because this money is supposed to go to the Pope, right? You can't just send it overland. It's not like a video game where you see all these carts moving up and down Europe, right? Didn't happen because highwaymen would come and rob it. So instead, you had banks and you had German, and I'm not talking about Jews either. You have German banks, the Fuggers were the big banking house in Germany. You have Italian bankers, you have others. And they all network with each other. And the Fuggers had banking houses in Rome themselves directly. So they would write credit to the Pope from their banking house in Germany, and that's what would get sent down. As you sent the gold down, highwaymen would grab it, and then, the transfers were extremely difficult to make happen unless you have armed guards and all that stuff. So it gets really expensive.
Yeah, but that costs money itself.
Yeah, it costs money itself. You don't want that. So and what sometimes would happen is that agents from the banking houses would come to collect the indulgence from some woman who's dying, is sick on her bed or whatever. So all those things add to the angst. And then the coup de grace was the Augustinians in Erfurt had the right of commissioning indulgences. When Tetzel comes to town, he's a Dominican. He transfers that right away from the Augustinians to the Dominicans. And that ticks off Luther's superior because that's a big form of revenue for the monastery and the university. So he comes to Luther and says, why don't you look into it? And the fruit of that is the 95 Theses. So this creates the angst. This creates the motion. And of course, what happens in short order is that Luther continues, and now he starts bringing his doctrines out. Now that he's sensed this popularity, he starts preaching in these various doctrines that he's held for a long time. He meets with Cardinal Cajetan de Vio, Gaetano de Vio, Thomas Gaetano de Vio, and not to be confused with Saint Cajetan, the Count of Thiene.
That's someone else. Yeah,
that's someone else. People sometimes mix them up. They're not. So Cajetan was Dominican. The Count of Thiene was a layman who starts a oratory for the love of God, which becomes the Theatines. And so anyway, so Cajetan meets with Luther, and he shows that, from, Catholic teaching, how it is that from the temporal, office for the Pope, he can, commit these things for the very love of Christ. That means to remit, the sins and the punishments of mankind. It was a bull, I forget which Pope the bull was from. So Luther seems to accept it. And in the contemporaneous witness that Luther gives was a very positive meeting with Cajetan. It gives him pause for the first time. Somebody's actually resisted him. But without too much longer, he goes right back to it and pushes on his heresy. So finally, he's condemned. Pope Leo X condemns him in the bull Exsurge Domine. And Luther responds by burning the bull and the entire corpus of canon law. And so the Reformation's on. Right, he throws off his habit. He declares that celibacy is an evil, and declares all the monks, if they wanted to stay Catholic, they had to leave. They had to go somewhere else. And the rest of the monks, they start leaving the monastery. They go marry, and so now Lutheranism is there to stay because it's got the political protection. Charles V comes into it, and because his grandfather Maximilian I was the emperor, and he was too old and sick to deal with it. Now Charles V, once he becomes Holy Roman Emperor, he's the king of Spain. Now he's also the Holy Roman Emperor, and he inherits this problem. So he has Luther condemned, but he can't just execute Luther because the German princes are holding Luther as like a political hostage. They're saying, well, if you want our help against the Turks, which is a very necessary thing at this point, because the Turks had made major incursions into Hungary. A few years later, they destroy the entire Hungarian army at Mohacs. And then in 1529, they'd be at the gates of Vienna. What's that?
The Battle of Mohawks, that's 1526. I think Vienna's when 15
years later.
59. So like in the late 20s, the Turks are on because I think the whole
and they were threatening up to that point. And so to have the Protestant, or not the Protestant, well, I mean, that's what the term comes about, to have the German prince's assistance against the Turks He would have to give them Luther as his political asset. And they knew that because they didn't like his Charles V centralizing policies in the empire. They didn't want him to run the empire, which is largely a confederation of various German states, the way he runs Spain as a de facto absolute monarch, right? They didn't want that. And so even though that's not exactly how Spain ran, that's how they thought it ran. And that's how they thought Charles was going to make it in Germany. So this was their bargaining chip to keep that from happening. And so Luther's allowed his protection. He goes on to write more books, and Charles has to abide it. And that's how that. So now you have whole swaths of Germany that are anti-Catholic, that are not, Catholic, that are now, in the Reformation. It's not a recent schism here. It's here to stay, and people are getting that realization gradually. So now back over to England, where we get to the meat of this whole business. So Henry hasn't been successful in war. He's organized that he's looking for ways to make his mark. And so he's looking for the victory denied to him in arms to be given to him in letters. And so he sees Luther publish these books against, the Church's sacraments. So De Babylonica Captivitate, on the Babylonian captivity of the church, where Luther argues that, first he argues there's three sacraments: baptism, the bread, Eucharist, and penance. Then he changes his mind as he's writing the book and decides penance isn't a sacrament. He gets rid of it.
That's in this book, actually.
Yeah. And so now it's two, just baptism and Eucharist. Those are the only two true sacraments. And then these have been locked away in these false sacraments in the reign of Antichrist, as in the reign of the popes. So Henry decides he's going to write a book against this. And now Henry was one of the best educated monarchs to sit on the throne since St. Alfred the Great. He was extremely learned, but he was not a theologian, properly speaking. Yeah, maybe a good lay theologian, and he brought in, and he wasn't so arrogant as just to write the book himself. He brings in expert theologians and learned men like St. Thomas More. Becomes his secretary in the whole affair, organizing and getting the papers in order. He brings in St. John Fisher, who was already celebrated as one of the great. And Fisher, I should add, we usually think of Fisher in terms of his martyrdom in the end, but in actuality, Fisher is like a superstar academic. He is the chancellor of the University of Cambridge. He was a major figure in the reign of Henry's father, Henry VII. And, he's been also one of the holiest bishops in Christendom. It's recognized as such because he's one of the few bishops that resides in his see. Even during the reign of Henry VII, when he was in full favor at court, he still insisted on residing principally in his see, Little Rochester, and administering to the flock there, in spite of being, the confessor to the Queen Mother, in spite of, the king wanted to involve him more in the kingdom, and he was somewhat involved, but he separated himself from that to administer his diocese, almost unheard of anywhere in Europe.
So, I just got to pause for a second. Would you say that around this time, 1520, 1525, 1530, that St. John Fisher would be the top Catholic theologian in all of Europe? He
was considered such. And largely because of his publication of his works against Luther. That's for the future, really. But his fame is growing. All right. So the first foray that he has against Luther is when, after Henry's written the book, pardon me, he's written the book and he's got it all organized. And so he has a great spectacle in 1521 at St. Paul's Cross, and where he has all these Lutheran tracts burned, and Fisher's appointed to preach the sermon. So he preaches a sermon against Luther and Luther's doctrine, and the theme of it is, of course, the assistance of the Holy Spirit given to the church. And, to point out the church is not going to err. Luther's stuff's nonsense. And oh, by the way, because it's part of Wolsey's stagecraft, he has to pause during the sermon to acknowledge that the king has written a book against the pestilential errors of Luther. And so Wolsey holds up the book and everyone's cheering. Henry wasn't there because he had an illness. If he had been there, probably people would have been cheering a lot longer, because Wolsey was generally detested. But he was also inefficient as a man. Cardinal Wolsey is a complicated character to bring into a couple of minutes, but he's the son of an Ipswich innkeeper who's usually on the wrong side of the law. And so he gets out of that way of life by going to the free grammar schools. He's brilliant, he's intelligent, but he doesn't. So normally in education, if you were brilliant and you learned your Latin very well, you had two tracks. You go into church or into state. You go into state, usually either you become a lawyer or you take other degrees, and then in letters, and then you make yourself, useful to the crown some way. If you go into church, you might also end up being useful to the crown some way, and then you're either going to theology or going to canon law. And so, Fisher had done that, and he had gone into theology, and he was brilliant in theology. Wolsey doesn't really go into either. He gets his degree in theology, but he's not a theologian properly. But he's a fixer. He's an arranger. He's an organizer. He knows how to get things done. And he makes himself useful to Henry very early on, when Henry's trying to get out of the influence of his father's counselors, right? And so because he's done all that, he gets Henry what he wants. And that's why Wolsey is in the position he's in, where he's the Archbishop of York. He's then made Cardinal Legate a latere. That is the special privilege of basically being, at the Pope's side, a latere, at the side, right? And so he is the Pope's official representative in England. So he's the guy, fixes stuff and organizes stuff. He's got high hopes he's going to be Pope someday, because of the status that he now enjoys in the kingdom and whatnot. So he organizes a spectacle. Fisher's already working on his own book against Luther. It's called the Confutatio, or what is the whole thing? Certione Lutheranae Confutatio, the confutation, the refutation of Luther's assertion. This is reassertion of all his articles, right? So, in the middle of doing that, he preaches the sermon, and then Henry's book comes out. It's actually really well argued. It's obviously the work of a layman. There's some people even today are kind of fooled by this. They think that maybe Fisher actually wrote the book. That's the fact that anyone thinks that at all. And even in the 16th century, some people are confused by it. Like the Antwerp editors end up putting it in the collected works of Fisher because they're just not sure. And that's the victory of Henry's propaganda, because in 1535, Henry's book on the Seven Sacraments is actually a bit of an embarrassment because of how strongly he advocates in favor of papal infallibility in the book, but principally in the preface, in the preface to it, the dedicatory epistle to Leo X. Papal supremacy is lauded in unquestionable terms, so strongly that Thomas More tries to put the brakes to Henry and says, well, my lord, the Pope, being a high and mighty monarch in temporal affairs as he is spiritual, being a monarch, he may come into conflict with you, who are also a mighty monarch. And Henry says, well, what of it? He says, well, suppose you and the Pope should be at loggerheads. Won't this be a bit of an embarrassment for you? And Henry's like, oh, no, not of course. And More, brings up a couple other objections, because ultimately at the time, More still held to conciliarism. He had not heard that Lateran V condemned conciliarism, and he had adhered a little more towards Erasmus and other humanists that thought that the prerogatives of the papacy were more to human tradition than divine. It wasn't until reading Fisher that More is convinced the other way. And so in the intervening years, of course, Henry will be convinced the other way toward the rejection of papal supremacy. It was kind of funny, and More is like trying to put the brakes on Henry, because he doesn't believe all the things in papal supremacy that Henry is writing. And it's only within the passage of the next couple of years that from the publication of Fisher's Confutatio of Luther to, Fisher's further treatises, where he realizes that, oh, wow, the patristic testimony in favor of the papacy is too strong. I've been wrong about this. And he sends Fisher a letter praising him, for his work and for helping reform his own mind on the question of the Pope's prerogatives and whatnot. So, he comes around on it. Henry goes the other way. It's kind of amusing, irony that from 1521 to 1535, the changes of position.
Oh yeah, because Thomas More must have been. Did Martin Luther ever dabble in like conciliarism over papal authority?
Up until the Pope called the council.
because
to a point, Luther uniformly rejects the authority of councils. As early as the Diet of Worms, he puts that into where the "Here I Stand" speech. Popes and councils, they contradict each other. So, but he will make lip service to conciliarism several times in the intervening years. To appealing from the Pope's judgments to even the Diet of Worms, he appeals Exsurge Domine to a future council, while at the same time attacking the authority of councils. So but it's like so many self-contradictions of Luther. The book I'm publishing from St. John Fisher, his defense of Henry VIII's book, he spends like a whole chapter talking in the early chapters, talking about Luther's contradictions, how he completely contradicts himself so many different times in so many different ways, but yet declares his doctrine comes straight from heaven.
Well, because I think in Martin Luther, in his debate with John Eck, which is, I think, 1519, like he's using conciliarism, but he had also praised John Huss. And then John Eck pointed out, if you're being all pro-council, the Council of Constance condemned John Huss to death. So, you're kind of contradicting yourself there.
Yep, and that's what he did. And he always did that, and just hope the average person, wouldn't catch him in it. So it was kind of funny how that goes.
Yeah.
So Henry's book comes out to great acclaim. Leo X is so excited that he concedes to Henry personal title of Fidei Defensor, which is still on the coins you use, right? Or no, actually not on your coins, but on British coinage today, the monarch has FD, Fidei Defensor. Or maybe it is on your coinage, actually. I'm not sure.
Let me check. Let me check. I don't think it is.
Yeah, it wasn't meant to be perpetual into the Henry successors, but it was meant to be, for his own person. Of course, that didn't stop him. And of course, he takes that in a very different sense once he's broken away from the church in the future. But so Henry, is rather pleased with himself, right? And then Luther notices the king's book, and he writes a response. His response against Henry, King of England. And he attacks Henry really scurrilously, doesn't really address any of Henry's arguments, or very rarely, mischaracterizes a good number of them, and then just hurls all sorts of abuse and name calling. So I don't think Henry had ever read things about his person in print before like that, but it would be treasonous to talk about your sovereign in that way. So Henry can't actually technically even acknowledge the book's existence because of royal protocol and etiquette. You just can't do that. So he taps More to write a response. So More does something rather unexpected, rather interesting. He writes it under a pen name of William Ross. And because William Ross had died in pilgrimage to Rome, an Englishman, people assumed that he had written the book. So it actually worked out rather well, and More was careful to try to conceal his authorship because it was a bit of an embarrassment to him, just as it is to Thomas More scholars today. But basically, the Responsio ad Convitia Martini Lutheri is the book that More writes, the response to Luther's cavil. And it's pretty strong in bad language. Although the Latin rude words in Latin are used there, the swear words, the cuss words, the worst, in fact. What More is doing with that book, he's not trying to, of course, use bad language for the sake of using bad language. And I would not recommend you start using F words and S words the way More does in that book on account of, Saint said that, so therefore I can say that. More has a very specific point. He takes all the rude words and puts them in very eloquent phrasing. He does a lot of turn of phrases, a lot of puns, a lot of satire, like his favorite poet, Lucan, the Greek poet. And so what he's trying to show is Luther is such a dunce, he can't even swear like an educated man. That's basically More's point. But ultimately, it's seen as kind of unedifying. So, Fisher is asked to write a response on top of the one he's already written in the Confutatio. So he writes the book that we mentioned earlier in the program that I've got on pre-order, The Defense of the Royal Assertion Against Luther's Babylonian Captivity. I had to work the title that way because the way it comes out literally from the Latin, people might look at it and think that Luther is the author of this book. So I had to rework the title just to make it make a bit more sense. They loved really long titles back then. So,
did they ever? Yeah.
Fisher and my translator, Jonathan Arrington, did a wonderful job. And so Fisher, Fisher's normal modus operandi is to quote Luther verbatim and go, and then respond to the arguments at far greater length. And he can't quite do that with this book because he can't repeat the things that Luther has said about his king. And so he takes a bit of a different approach. He does quote Luther in the book, but he doesn't, but he can't do his normal thing of quoting the entire thing and moving on. So he, takes on Luther's arguments. He shows Luther's contradictions. He runs with the theme that Luther is like a fox, the Volpine character, and that he's shifty, self-contradictory. He claims his doctrines come from heaven, yet they do not. He's got so there's 12 chapters in the book. The first is Luther's deceit and his arrogance, and the claiming that all his doctrines come from heaven. And Fisher just shows why that's absurd. In the second chapter, the covering for his vices and everything, how Luther tried to cover his own vices. Then he takes on the question of utraquism, that is the Hussite thing of communion under both kinds, right? Then, then a lot of the rest of it's to the Eucharist and the Mass. And then finally he'll add on, one of the best contributions of this book is one of Luther's big points is appealing to the people. The people get to judge the doctrines. The people judge what is and isn't a dogma. And so Fisher shows against that is actually the unanimity of the fathers in interpreting the scripture, that it must be believed, not this or that of the people at any given time. He shows how that's, big sophism. And then, so that basically you have to, the fathers are the prime thing. And then, of course, scripture, too. He gets in a lot of scriptural exegesis to show that Luther really doesn't understand the scriptures. And finally, he has a defense of orders and matrimony, which is basically adding more to what he didn't cover in the Confutatio. So it's a really good book. He held off with it for a couple of years because he heard Luther might convert, and that turned out to be false. And so eventually he publishes the book in 1525. So then, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious. So, in like the 1520s, the war between the English currently Catholics and the German Lutherans is in full swing. But so, like these books that are going back and forth, like are the average people reading these books? Like the average people who know how to read, or is it just the clergy, just the kings?
This is mostly, Fisher's book there's a reason why, even though Fisher's English, this book has never been in English before. He wrote it in Latin for a European audience. And the same thing with his other treatises. So what people are reading are tracts. So this is stuff to influence the educated men, to fill the need for Catholic apologetics. And so theologians and priests and whatnot are picking this up. They're reading this, and then they're arming themselves with this argumentation to meet the assault of the Protestants. And that's kind of the need, is for like from a top down sort of thing. What people are actually reading are pamphlets. And this is one place where the church was really weak. They hadn't realized the use of the printing press. And one of the most efficient causes of the introduction of Lutheran doctrines into England is a man named William Tyndale. And so Tyndale, I forget the causes. He had published the New Testament, and he had to flee because Henry VIII was going to put him to death. So he goes to Germany, and he's basically learning from Martin Luther, and he's listening to Luther, and he's translating Luther's sermons, Luther's pamphlets into English and sending these back to England. And that's what people are reading. He does a New Testament that people have. Now, in the error with his New Testament is even pointed out, even Thomas More pointed it out, that there's no reason why the average man can't have the scripture in his own language, but Tyndale's he should not have, because Tyndale does the most ridiculous translations to attack the church's teaching and theology, and that was it was the same issue with Wycliffe, with John Wycliffe back a few hundred years prior. Was Wycliffe had done this English translation. It wasn't really serviceable as proper English anyway. In that time that would have been Middle English, but they were so faithful to the Vulgate text, which isn't a bad thing per se, but they wouldn't even change the word order when they put it into English, right? And so it becomes scarcely intelligible in the Middle English that people would have heard it in. And on top of that, Wycliffe's anti-clericalism would cause him to render anything that might have had an alternate term from priest or bishop into just the bare sense of it, as if it had nothing to do with any sacred orders or anything. That's just one place. Other places that support his doctrines on grace. Donatism is another belief of Wycliffe's, and so the holiness of the minister is what made these things valid, right? And so that's what Tyndale does. Similar things, although Tyndale isn't a Donatist, but Tyndale did bring out, the same type of anti-clerical bent into his translations of the scripture. And
Well,
so then he's translating Lutheran tracts, smuggling it all back in.
Well, and I know for the famous papal proof text in Matthew 16, upon this rock I will build my church. I think he said build my assembly, right?
Right, because that's a very literal rendering. I mean, the Hebrew, the assembly, ecclesiastes and the assembly. That's assembly people. Ecclesia in Greek can mean the assembly, the gathered group, but it has a very specific technical meaning. Even as it's employed in the New Testament, it's not just the assembly, even though it harkens back to the people Israel, the church of the Old Testament. That word church, as we get it from the Anglo-Saxon, kirken, is something that follows a certain technical terminology that even is understood in the New Testament. Doesn't just mean assembly. It means very specifically the church established by Christ, the assembly established by Christ. And so desacralizing the Anglo-Saxon word church to go to a literal meaning of the Greek outside of its context, then you lose what's actually going on, right? And that's which goes in rather more for Tyndale's assembly of believers, essentially, that there is no institutionalized formal church. So that's one of the dangers in desacralizing the translation. And that's why after Wycliffe, there was a law in English peculiar to England forbidding any translations of scripture whatsoever, whereas in the continent, it was more, case by case, ad hoc. And you had translations of significant parts of scripture into most vernacular languages on the continent because you didn't have anything like you had with Wycliffe until Luther came around. So, and it's it's one of these great myths that Luther brought everyone the Bible. The Bible was already there. And people saw it in art. It was preached to them. People knew you just look at the contemporary witnesses of names, of references, jokes, scriptural stories. People knew their Bibles better at that period than people know them today when everyone could read and we have them in cheap paperback copies, right? I mean, people probably knew their Bibles better in those times than at any age except for the 19th century. And I say that because in the 19th century, not just necessarily everyone literate, everyone had to read the Bible and know their Bible no matter what. And so, at least in the Anglosphere anyway, in the 19th century, I would just say that they had better scriptural knowledge than they had in the 16th century. But certainly better scriptural knowledge than we have today. When we can read it, nobody does, right? But, it's part of the common bread in life. So, and not to mention that for most people in Europe, there were translations available if you could read it all. And so, I mean, we could go on to kind of the older canards too, but we're going to kind of lose the plot here on the English Reformation. So there is a historical accident that happens that leads to it all. So Henry is this great stalwart, and I've taken an hour and 20 minutes to talk about what a stalwart Catholic king Henry is for the most part, and in spite of his various vices, and how Catholic, you have the situation in England, and then something happens. Well, there's another series of wars against France with Spain. Charles V comes to England, hat in hand. He's got this revolt that I mentioned in the Commonwealth revolt in Spain, which revolts against his authority, and he's got to go put it down. He's got to, he needs help. He wants to fight the French, and so he promises to make Wolsey Pope. He promises to pay back all the money it's owed since Ferdinand. He promises all these sorts of things, as well as the partition of France and giving Henry significant portions of France. And so Henry loans him money and gets it all going. It's called the Great Enterprise. This is in 1523. And so that's where it begins. So Charles gets back to Spain, puts down the Commonwealth revolt, and then Henry puts his troops in the field in 1524. Defeats the French in several significant battles. Charles never materializes. 1524, the Duke of Surrey is within striking distance of Paris. Charles never materializes. So, and this is all very expensive. Lots of taxation going on, which is irregular. The normal course of tax cuts are normal. Tax increases are exceptional. And tax increases are temporary. Tax cuts are what everything reverts to. It's the exact opposite of the way it works today, right? We cut the taxes, but it was only for a couple of years and they go right back to where they were unless you renew them again. It works exactly the opposite in the Middle Ages. The tax cuts were normal. And then, because if you tax the people too much, you get more revolt, and that sort of thing. So the anyway, Henry can't afford to be in the field in 1525, so he sits it out. 1525, of course, is the Battle of Pavia, where where Charles, fights Francois I at the Battle of Pavia, defeats the French, takes Francois I prisoner, and Henry didn't have any troops in the field. So a messenger comes to Henry, and so he sends a message to Charles real quick, giving God thanks for this great victory, and let us now destroy this blasphemous Valois monarchy, which is an offense against God, and take the spoils ourselves. Now, Charles just got rid of one powerful rival. He doesn't want to create another. So he told Henry, if you want your part of France, you have to conquer it. And so Henry scrambles, tries to get troops in the field. There's just no money. He goes to Parliament. Parliament will not vote new tax increases because they just did it recently, and there's no stomach for it. Even Wolsey and Thomas More, between each other, can't do the good cop, bad cop thing like they did in 1523. They can't get the money. So Wolsey is the spin doctor in chief. He comes up with this new idea. Let's do a forced loan, and we'll call it the amicable grant. It wasn't very amicable. Nobody liked it. Not only were the nobles resisting it, but even the peasants were revolting over it because they knew the nobles would come take it out of their purse, and they couldn't afford it. So the church was revolting against it. The House of Lords was against it. So they had to drop it. No money, no new troops. Henry was not going to get his portion of France. It all crumbled. And on top of that, so in the lead up to the grand enterprise, right, where Charles V goes to London, makes all these deals with Henry and everything, right, he had also betrothed himself to Henry's daughter, Mary, who was 6 at the time. And now that stuff was normal, by the way, in case anyone's wondering. Obviously, it wasn't going to be fulfilled until she was old enough. But he breaks the betrothal, completely jilts Mary, and then, what was the name of his first wife? I forget. I can look it up on Wikipedia, but anyway, I don't remember it. So anyways, he marries someone else. Mary's out. Catherine's out, more importantly. And that's the big thing. The whole dynastic reasoning of the marriage was the alliance with Spain, this great power, which will do so many great things for England. Where is that power now? What benefits has that brought to England? None. Bubkiss. And on top of that, Charles V still hasn't even paid back the money, which he's owed. Which Henry's owed. So Henry's not feeling good about the Spanish or anybody's Spanish, including his wife. So he's in a foul mood. This is 1525. Now, in the interim, there's a real dynamo who showed up at court. An English woman that was trained so well in France that she speaks French as well as the French do, which is very rare that the French would praise an English woman's French. And she's like a French cocotte with big black eyes, sexy rather than beautiful. She's got a train of simps running around court. Anne Boleyn. And at some point, Henry notices. We don't know exactly when he notices. So Anne Boleyn, man, I could do another hour on Anne Boleyn, but just suffice it to say, to make it succinct, her dad was minor gentry, merchants that ennobled themselves, and he was really impressed with the Archduchess Margaret in the Netherlands, who's the sister of Charles V. She ran a sort of finishing school for girls, more or less, and so he sends Anne there, where she is made, fluent in French. She's in all the ways of court and etiquette and so many different things. And then eventually she's, when Henry's sister was married to the French King Louis XII, she went to the French court, where she was also would continue to be trained in the ways of royal etiquette. And she becomes a big fixture of the French court. And she's also very intelligent, extremely. She sees how mistresses are used and then discarded. And so she is, she determines she will not be discarded. So she's not going to give up the goods. She's not going to be someone's mistress. And that's the philosophy she takes on. So again, just like in the French court too, under Francois I, she has all these simps in her train. She's a true French coquette in that sense where, she can, bring the eyes in and get you to do whatever she wants, but she's never going to sleep with you. And that works. She is this huge dynamo. So Wolsey comes up with this scheme to settle a debate with various nobles, the Lord Protector of Ireland and some of his family squabbles by marrying Anne off to some part of the family. So he has her recalled. And that ends up falling apart. So Anne is just kind of in court as one of Catherine's ladies in waiting. She encounters a man named Thomas Percy. His dad was a big scion of the Percys up in the north of England, and potential threat. So his son was in Wolsey's household as a political hostage, basically to guarantee good behavior. And he and Anne fall in love, and truly in love, and they make an act of betrothal. Meanwhile, Anne, continues to work her magic. So she's got all the, like Thomas Wyatt, for example, court poet. He was his marriage didn't work out so well for him, so he didn't go the route of trying to get some kind of annulment or anything. He just in those days you call it a divorce, but it didn't mean what we mean today when we say divorce. I'll get to that a bit in a minute. It was rather, he just decided, okay, I'm just going to do what I want, and she can do what she wants, and whatever. And that's what he does. And so he sees Anne. He's passionately in love with Anne, and Anne knew exactly how to turn on the heat and put you back in the friend zone very quickly, and yet keep you
one of them. Oh,
yeah, one of them, exactly. She's very good at it. And so but she really truly did love Thomas Percy. He was trying to extricate himself from his own situation so he could marry her. Sometime probably in 1526, Henry takes notice. And he decides, now Henry had several mistresses before. Bessie Blount, for example, Elizabeth Blount, who was called Bonnie Bess. He'd had a bastard son by her, Henry Fitzroy. He had Anne Boleyn's older sister, Mary, who was very beautiful but very stupid by contemporary accounts. I just mean she was not a particularly intelligent woman, but she was very beautiful. Of course, her lack of intelligence saved her. She wasn't so cunning. She was happy just to take her place wherever. So she didn't get her head cut off. Once she conceives, Henry gets rid of her, because ultimately, and the same thing with Bessie Blount, once she has a baby, he gets rid of her, because for Henry, it's one thing to mess around with a woman, even another man's wife, but once she gets pregnant, that's a mom now. I don't want anything to do with that. So he's looking for someone else, and shows up on the radar. So now that he finds out about this whole thing with Percy and the betrothals, he's got to get rid of him. So he has Wolsey step in as the wingman. And Wolsey, and mind you, Henry's already decided he needs to do something about his marriage, but he hasn't figured, the form of it hasn't taken shape yet. Very likely without Anne, it would have happened anyway. It just would have been someone else, but Anne, nevertheless, it was, and that's how it takes shape. So Wolsey steps in and browbeats Percy, brings his father down, and finally forces him to break the betrothal. But and Percy was a bit of a dilettante, but the amount of resistance he gives even to Wolsey, who could terrify far greater men, shows that he truly was passionately in love with Anne, and she with him. And so eventually they make him break the betrothal, breaks Anne's heart. And according to George Cavendish, who's Wolsey's secretary, he says at that very moment, she contrived to do as much damage to my master, Cardinal Wolsey, as he had done to her. That's how Cavendish puts it. And he's not wrong. And because she didn't realize the source of it, and it didn't all come out later. Oh, he was working for you. Okay, I like Wolsey now. No, this hurt her very deeply. And she determined that Wolsey, she was going to get her revenge on Wolsey when the time came, which she did. So anyway, so now once Percy's clear, the field is clear, and now Henry can work. And so Henry then sends her message. And at first, there was no real plan in it all. Anne just said no, because she's just coming on the rebound from this betrothal being broken. Her heart's broken. She doesn't want to be a mistress. And then but on Henry's side, this just inflames him. So now we know how this looks on Henry's side of the correspondence, because the letters were snatched up by a servant at some point during the king's great matter and taken off to Rome, and where they're in the Vatican. They're now actually part of the Vatican library. So, and I've actually seen them in the original. Henry's writing. They're written in French, and Henry's writing, very passionately trying to convince her to be his mistress. We can guess about what she said, probably very likely after the whole thing soured with Anne and she was beheaded and Henry is married to one of his next few wives. He burned those letters probably. They haven't survived. But we know Henry's side of it because they got whisked off to the Vatican. So we can guess that Anne is resisting. Anne is saying no. Anne actually removes herself to her country estates in order to be away from it all. But eventually she yields, and in 1527, she offers Henry a present. Oh, darn it. I can't remember the French word for it, but it's a French word that in the parlance of the time refers to a New Year's present, only given at New Year's. I can't remember what that is off the top of my head, that word. But
do you speak French, Ryan?
No, I can read it all right. At least older French, I can read all right, and academic stuff, but I can't speak it to save my life. Even if I try, all your Anglophone audience is going to, your Francophone audience is going to think I'm purposely going on my way to mock you in good English tradition, right? I'm not trying to do that, so I'm not going to try to get the French. I just don't remember the word at the moment. Maybe somebody else does, but so it's she does that. And then which signals her yielding to Henry. And we can guess the condition is that she will be his wife, not his mistress. And so, and once we understand that, and that's the date in which the actual association begins, 1527. Now we can understand all the further events. 1527 in April, I believe, or March of 1527. Henry has Wolsey set up this mock trial, or not a mock trial, but a trial of sorts of his marriage, where it's all play acted. One of Henry's, gentlemen, the court accuses the king of living in an adulterous relationship with his wife, with his brother's widow, who was not really his wife. And because of this verse of Leviticus, you shall not marry your brother's wife; it is an unclean thing, and you shall be barren. Right. And so on the basis of that, he's actually been in an adulterous relationship with his brother's widow, who's not truly his wife, namely Catherine of Aragon. And so they started, so he has Wolsey to have an official court examination of this matter. Catherine gets wind of it. So she already knows it's coming, but she doesn't quite have all the details. She doesn't know exactly what's going on. Wolsey gets to a point where he's trying to work out the theological arguments. He's just not sure. So he goes on a visit to Rochester by night, meets with St. John Fisher, and kind of lays it out in this objective thing. Well, yeah, there's a case of somebody who's married to his brother's widow, and he suddenly doesn't believe that his marriage is valid. And what do we do? And Fisher knows exactly what's going on. At one time, he had been confessor to Queen Catherine. So, he knows exactly what's afoot. And he tells Wolsey that, that verse in Leviticus, the fathers usually read in conjunction with this one in Deuteronomy, that if your brother's widow dies childless, that you marry her so as to raise up sons to his name. And therefore, they read them in unison rather than against. And so then Fisher gives other arguments, and which is the very thing Wolsey was dreading, that the greatest theologian in Christendom at that moment was against the king in the matter of the divorce. We'll call it a divorce because that's the parlance of the time, but it doesn't mean what we mean today, where the idea that the state comes in and says, all right, you're not married anymore. That's not what Henry was seeking. He was seeking what today we call an annulment, really, declaring that the sacrament was always invalid. But just for the parlance of the time and how customary it's become, we'll call it the divorce. So Henry, Wolsey reports this back, Fisher's opinion, and Henry's like, well, that was just a ceremonial law for the Jews, but he's annoyed by it because he really wanted Fisher on his side. And so Wolsey's working it out, and the more he comes across, he's just not sure. Now, Wolsey, as the Pope's personal representative in England, he had the power to declare this annulment right then. And it was highly, highly unlikely the Pope would have reversed it. And Wolsey knew that. So why does Wolsey do what he does next? He suspends the trial and sends the judgment to Rome because the case is too hard, which Henry's rather surprised of it. And he tells Henry, I'll just work my contacts in Rome, and the Pope will do it. That way it can't be reversed. And Henry's like, oh, okay. But in reality, it probably would not have been reversed if Wolsey did it. Why did Wolsey do it? Various people have different theories, and maybe he was suddenly struck with a persistent attack of Christianity. And he just had a trial of conscience where, ultimately, it really was a hard case. And he just couldn't, in his own conscience, sit with fixing this up for the king the way he'd already done everything else, even though Wolsey is not exactly faithful to his vows. He's got a bastard son. He's got a bastard daughter through a mistress. He's not, he's never resided at his own as a bishop's see in York. He's an absentee bishop with a lot of corruption and a lot of things in his train that aren't very good. All of a sudden, he has this attack of conscience. I can't do it. But he figures, hey, well, once the Pope does it, then at least it's on him and not on me. So he sends the case over to Rome, and he hopes his contacts can work it all in his favor. Well, the only problem was this is 1527, and the next month is the Sacco di Roma, the sack of Rome. And
Landsknecht,
the Landsknecht. So what happens there is that, we mentioned that Charles V had captured the French king. He does release the French king, and eventually, releases his sons that he had taken as political hostages, expecting good behavior. But the Italian wars kindle on again. And now the Pope is afraid that Charles V is too powerful. So Clement VII allies himself with the French, the League of Chambord. And so Charles is really ticked off about this. Hey, look, I've taken on so much stuff to defend the church here. I condemn Luther, even though it was in my political interest to do otherwise. I've defended the church's interests again and again and again. And here you go stabbing in the back. Well, Clement, let me show you. So he orders his army to be brought in striking distance of Rome, just to let the Pope know this is a very bad idea. And the idea that Charles had was to make him switch back to the right side, that is, to the imperial side. Meanwhile, in Rome, goodness, what was the guy's name? Bartolomeo. There's a holy man of various prophecies. He's called Il Brandano, but his name is Bartolomeo de I can't remember his full name. He gets on the statue of St. Paul at St. Paul's, the statue of St. Peter that's present at St. Paul's outside the walls. And he declares, Clement, thou man of Sodom, for thy sins, this city will be destroyed in 2 weeks' time. Repent, or you shall see. And in 2 weeks' time, the army of Charles V mutinies. The Landsknechts. Now, the Landsknechts are, I could do like a 2-hour thing on Landsknechts. The Landsknechts are like a private military corps. And they have their own rules, their own regulations. Some of them are Lutheran, some of them are Catholic, right? And the corps will decide which way they go, and they have their own commanders, and they'll fight for whoever's going to pay them. They were originally meant to be part of the imperial army, but eventually Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor before Charles, his grandfather, he couldn't afford them. And
there were also some Spanish and Italians in that army as well.
Yes, because they were mercenaries, and so you might not care if you were at a Lutheran corps or a Catholic corps. You'll sign up because you need the money, and war is good money. So that's what they did, and so they mutinied and took on a new commander, and they decided to go because Charles had neglected to pay his army, so they go to Rome looking for cash. And basically demanding the Pope pay their wages. And Clement VII told them to go packing. And he tried to send a message to the League of Chambord, hey, I got this mutinous army here, you got to do something about it. So they stormed the city and Rome wasn't prepared for an attack because they didn't expect one. So, and their fortifications were still rather medieval. They weren't set up for modern pike and went up, but ultimately it was ladders that did the day. And the Landsknechts are able to overwhelm the Swiss guards and make their way into the city. And it's just a wave of pillage and rape and looting, things that would have made the Nazis or the Soviets blush, honestly. Scenes of horror and just terrible things in the sack of Rome. The Pope escapes to Castel Sant'Angelo, and the army, the mutinous army, is now in control of Rome. So Charles decries what had done, but he's not going to let a crisis go to waste. And so he takes the situation. So the Pope is his prisoner in Castel Sant'Angelo as the city is being raped and destroyed and brought to ruin. And in some ways, some commentators say rightly so for the Renaissance paganism that the popes had pursued to employ in the city. There's this just judgment of God for all that. And then the next thing that happens is Wolsey's appeal comes to the Pope. And in the meantime, Catherine had discovered what was going on. She had appealed to her nephew, who never gave a damn about her in the past or her position in England. But now this is also a bargaining chip in the politics of power. And so Charles takes her part and tells the Pope, you're not going to hear this appeal. And you're not going to adjudicate this whole thing. Pardon me. So Wolsey's plans are all dashed. The whole thing goes awry. It's just disaster. And so, once what happens then is that over the winter, plague enters the city, and so the Charles V's army starts dying in higher numbers. The Pope is able to flee to Independence at Gaeta, and then Henry's ministers find him there. So eventually, Henry is able to wrangle out of Clement VII a decretal commission, which will be chaired by Cardinal Campeggio, who is actually an absentee bishop in England, even though he's a papal emissary. Campeggio is an interesting guy. His wife died. I forget how old he was when his wife died. So he was a lawyer. So he entered church service and then got a degree in canon law as well as civil. And he was like your negotiator, closer. He wasn't, a corrupt cardinal in the way that other churchmen might be corrupt, but he was mostly interested in the affairs in the business of his family and enriching his family members rather than particularly the service to the church as such. And so, but he was the negotiator. He's your closer. He's the guy you get in to talk you down into whatever he wants you to say. Right. And so he's dispatched to England to chair this decretal commission. So now this is the interesting part. So Catherine isn't just sitting idly by embroidering and everything. She's got a whole network of intelligence. This is probably how Henry's letters to Anne get swept up and taken to the Vatican, is through this network. She is like 2 steps ahead of Henry's lawyers at any given time. And so the work of the decretal commission is to look at the bull of Julius II, which had given a dispensation to Henry to marry Catherine. Now, consanguinity, like today, we don't think much about this, but if your brother marries someone, then she or you're married to a woman, her sister is considered your sister in law, and that's good enough for canon law to call it consanguinity, even though you're not actually related in blood. So you need to be dispensed from that because it's only 1 degree below being an actual sister, which can't be dispensed from. So this and that's how it was dealt with in those days. Whereas now it's just relations above the 3rd degree. It didn't have anything to do with like the associations brought in by law, so like it did back then. So and you see this too because Henry actually asks for a bull of dispensation from the Pope during this whole process to be dispensed from his adulterous relationships with Anne's older sister in order to marry Anne, right? That he does that in 1529. But in the meantime, so 1527 rolls on, go into 1528, and this process is going on, dragging on. Henry's forced to keep up appearances with Catherine and things, even though, he knows that she knows that he knows, and right, and they don't really have any knockout, drag-out fights. But one thing to note about Henry is he's very non-confrontational. He likes other people to do his bidding. He doesn't like to be the guy in there, yelling and screaming and beating at you. He's not good at that. He has somebody else do it for him, even though he might conceive of malice behind the scenes. So in this case, they try to get all this work done. So the decretal commission will just rule the bull is defective. And it rested on various points. Will the alliance between England and Spain be maintained without this marriage? And that's because one of the reasons why it was given. And if they can show the alliance between England and Spain would have been otherwise maintained, then, the bull is, no good and whatnot. So Catherine produces a brief given by Julius II to Isabella, which says that the reasons for the dispensation are far more narrow and specifically related to the case, not to these other questions the decretal commission was looking at. So when Catherine drops this like a bomb in 1529, as they're getting ready to go to trial, she basically neutered 14 months of work by Henry's lawyers in one blow. And so this is really pissing Henry off. And finally, so they have to get up a whole new case, and they go to the legatine court. And Henry's like pulling every string he can to get the outcome he wants. Catherine has appealed directly to the Pope, but she's going to. But the problem is that a woman needs to be seen as carrying out her husband's will, so she can't just do it, or she'll be betraying her husband's trust, and she's not ready to go that far. She needs something. So the trial opens up, and Henry's there and Catherine's there, and Catherine does this extraordinary thing. And it's complicated because the way they have this courtroom set up in Greenwich at Blackfriars, the Dominican convent there, monastery there, we'd say. But she walks across they're all both set up in a dais, and she has to come down and go through where these benches are set up for lawyers and judges and whatnot, and come directly to Henry and makes this appeal, such as you see it in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. The whole thing is drawn from Cavendish, who was there, and given a poetic flair in Shakespeare's play on it. But and she's appealing to him. Haven't I been your wife? And so she puts Henry on the spot. And Henry, of course, whenever he goes against Catherine, he always loses because he's non-confrontational. And he has this. Henry's raised by women. His older brother Arthur is getting the king's education. Henry's raised with his sisters and raised by his mother originally. And so, which is very unique for a king. And so he has this particular affection for women, even though, he can be quite as brutal as he wants, but in their presence especially. And he's no good at arguing with them. He always loses. And that's one thing Anne had pointed out to Henry. Whenever he gets an argument with Catherine, he loses. So she puts him on the spot. And so, don't you think that, we should prove the bond good? And he says, well, of course I want the bond proved good. Then am I allowed to appeal to Rome so we can have this tried in an independent court? And he says, well, of course. He gives up the game. So now she can appeal to Rome without looking disobedient to her husband at the same time. And Henry's been put on the spot in public, giving his word as a king, and he can't take it back. So which, of course, again, kind of deneuters the work of the legatine court. So Catherine makes her appeal to Rome, and she refuses to show up at the legatine court again. It continues. And so Henry, brings in his various judges. He's trying to strong arm the bishops. And so the lawyers for Catherine's side, Archbishop Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Fisher was one of them. They try to strong arm them in giving an opinion in favor of the king's position on the divorce. And Fisher had refused to acknowledge the strong arming that was going on. So in this case, the silence veiled dissent, so that when they read this out, they say, but all the bishops have sealed on, in favor of this, my lords. And Fisher says, nay. And then Henry's confused. He's like, isn't this your seal? He's like, it is not my seal. It was put there for me, but I did not consent thereunto. And so Fisher then proceeds to go on, and he's been writing. He's been very busy in the meantime. And he writes out, just like he did against Luther. And actually that prepared him for this ground, the whole argumentation. He prepares a whole case, not a canonical one, but a theological one, in defense of marriage, scriptural exegesis, basically showing that the marriage between Henry and Catherine is good, laying out all these various axioms, all these various points. And after he's done, he presents the book, he summarizes it, and then he declares that, like a new John the Baptist, he is ready to lay down his life for the validity of the king's marriage to the queen.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's huge. Needless to say, Henry's not happy. The Fisher's early biographer, this was written a few years after his death, so there's certain things that are questionable. He relates a scene that happened prior to the legatine court even opening, where Henry had called for Fisher and wanted to unburden his conscience and give him those problems. And then Fisher tells him, well, my lord, put your conscience at rest right now, and lays out various points for why the king's marriage is valid. So Henry kind of thanks him. And according to the early biographer, as Fisher departed, the king never looked upon him with favor ever again.
Well, that makes sense.
Yes,
Does I'm curious. You said earliest biographer. Is this Reynolds or?
No. It was somebody who was certainly alive during this time, because he knows too many events he wouldn't have had access to just from archival material. It was published during the reign of Queen Mary. Probably written during the reign of Queen Mary too, at least in a book form, and then it had to be only the Latin version of it survives, because it had to be published on the continent after Mary is dead and Elizabeth comes in. and reimposes Protestantism. So that's the earliest biographer. There's a translation of it somewhere that I'm still trying to get my hands on that Father Philip Hallett had made back in the 30s. So it's like the principal biographical source. It is to Fisher's life what Roper's account is to Moore's, basically.
Oh yeah, because I've got like in this book, it's the bio of Cardinal Wolsey and the bio of Thomas More. But
and Moore's is written by his son-in-law William Roper. Although Roper is not an unbiased witness. There's certain things where Roper just doesn't understand what's actually going on. He doesn't understand like the legal stuff, and he renders the account a bit wrong. And there's other places where Roper is trying to, because Roper was a real scoundrel, honestly. And he in places where he would look bad, he's always trying to rework his character to look better than he really was. But nevertheless, I'm not going to go into that right now. I mean, too many tangents, and so it keeps us busy for quite a while. So the legatine court kind of continues, and points are being made for Henry's side, and Henry really thinks he's at the point where Cardinal Campeggio and Cardinal Wolsey will find in his favor. Campeggio is sitting on a secret brief from Clement VIII, telling him to delay and to not render any certain judgment. And he's wondering, but he has the king on the other side is to be furious. He's trying to figure out how he can do it. So he decides to adjourn for Midsummer's holiday, and and convokes the case to Rome, and the legatine court never meets again. And Henry had expected a favorable verdict instead, and he didn't get it. The French ambassadors expected the legatine court would find in Henry's favor. It doesn't. So Henry is livid. The Duke of Norfolk slams his fist on the table in front of Wolsey and Campeggio and says, "Never did a cardinal do any good in England." And so with the kind of the inference that, the Pope, he needs to scratch the king's back here, or else we might go elsewhere. And Wolsey had warned the Pope that if Henry didn't get his way, he may very well go into schism over it. And so, but Clement VII was very unwilling, because he's in an impossible situation himself. Charles V's armies are in Italy. Henry's over in England. So he actually even expresses several times, if only Wolsey had just decided this thing way back, we wouldn't have to be dealing with this now. And on top of that, Henry has good reason to hope for a positive outcome, because Pope Alexander VI had annulled Louis XII's marriage to Queen Jeanne d'Arcy on the basis of a lie, which Alexander VI fully suborned once he decided he wanted the French influence in Italy and side with that. Namely, that they have the queen, who has already given birth, declare that she was incontinent from the time of their wedding. And they affirm that in evidence, and the Pope affirms that it's a lie. And on the basis of that, Louis XII is given an annulment to marry someone else. So, I mean, if you want to get to the ridiculous things, I mean, Henry's got good cause to think he can get his way on this, because more ridiculous cases than his very competent and what he considered a very obvious legal
have gone through,
we've gone through, but it doesn't, and largely it's the politics, and on Catherine's side we could say some other things. So now Henry changes his general. Anne will be the general henceforth. So Wolsey's fall is not far after this, and the reason for that is Wolsey was the guy who got Henry what he wanted. That's why he had the position that he had. That's why he enjoyed the power that he did, as resented as he was by the nobility and by the church on the other side, or by the churchmen, I should say. Soon as he fails to get Henry what he wanted, Henry strips the title of the chancellorship from Wolsey, and he starts preparing a trial for treason against Wolsey. And while Wolsey is working on letters, trying to get all these the appeals to the Pope to give Henry what he wants, somehow he can come through at the last minute, because ultimately Anne has been speaking in Henry's ear against Wolsey and setting up his downfall. And now it comes. So Henry had said men sent to fetch Wolsey for a trial for treason, and Wolsey dies of a heart attack before that. According to Cavendish, saying, if only I had supported, if I had he worked as hard for my God as I did for my king. It served my God as I did my king.
That's a cardinal too.
Yeah. But, he was a king's man, ultimately, and over and above the church. Fisher was God's man, over and above the king. And so now, Henry goes to More.
Well, with Thomas More,
King's man, but God's first.
Yeah,
and he wants More to be the chancellorship. Now More accepts this with the proviso. He does not agree with Henry on the whole divorce question. He's not going to pursue that course of action, but he also will not fight against it either. And he will serve Henry's interest in all other ways. And Henry accepts that. And but part of this is the first Lord High Chancellor who is not also a churchman in several centuries worth of memory. And so as Lord High Chancellor, More, what it is, it's basically a foreshadowing of, it's a opening salvo of Henry's repudiation of papal authority. More doesn't see that yet, but he will in the coming years. So another person who survives Wolsey's fall is Wolsey's secretary, Thomas Cromwell. And not a lot's known about Cromwell's early life. We know that at one point he was a soldier in Italy, and he trained in Venice in their diplomatic corps for a while because they really liked him. And he came back to England around 1527 or so, got a job for Wolsey as all this stuff is unfolding. And he's manages to survive Wolsey's fall and make himself useful to Henry as the secretary for Latin letters. And so he now enters kind of Henry's inner circle this way. He's a very Protestant-minded leanings, and More is obviously not, but More, is More is a perfect pick for High Chancellor because he's not just a lawyer, but he's one of the preeminent lawyers of his time. And he had so many accolades and so many privileges at all the major inns. He would lecture in all the most complicated disciplines, for many, many years. He was very much the peer of his circle in the law.
And I believe he's the patron saint of Catholic lawyers, right?
Yes, he is. And so, I have a series of lectures on this on the Crusade channel. You have to subscribe to get them. And I have about 2 episodes talking about More in his legal career and what all this stuff meant. He had a lecture in what they call law French. Law French is essentially, so the English law courts at the highest levels, Star Chamber and whatnot, they were conducted not in English, but in Anglo-Norman French. And so major part of most laws that would be cited, even though you didn't conduct all the proceedings in them, would have been, again, in Anglo-Norman French. And so we have an echo of that in the United States Supreme Court and in all U.S. federal courts when they open up and they say, ooh-yay, ooh-yay, ooh-yay. What's this ooh-yay stuff? Well, you probably recognize the word. Ooh-yay, Anglo-Norman French. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye is the plural imperative. And so we have an echo of where does that come from? Star Chamber.
Really?
And that's right there in all the federal courts and in the military courts.
Wow, that's medieval Anglo-Norman French.
Yeah. And so, and that remained for a very long time. There's still books published in the 1700s on Anglo-Norman French because it was entirely, so that's what, in contemporaneously, they call that law French. And More was absolutely fluent in it. And it was like a normal course of study that he lectured in. Right. And so as Lord High Chancellor, he's in the perfect position. I mean, the bar is like loaded up with cases that Wolsey, because Wolsey is playing politics, he's rarely ever doing the job of a Lord High Chancellor. You get a lackey to do it. And you got cases backed up. So More just takes these on. And that's part of the work he busies himself with, not be involved in Henry's machinations on the divorce front. And they get to a point in 1530 where he asks for the next case to be brought in, and the bailiff tells him there are no more cases. And he says, well, praise God, because he's finally gotten through his 7-year backlog. But he's known to be absolutely just and in so many ways. I mean, we could talk about More. More wrote a book called Utopia. And a lot of people don't understand this book because the Marxists try to claim this as its own. So people think, is he talking about some kind of communism here? It's not what it's about at all. It's a Tudor satire, ultimately, which is trying to make the argument there is no good government. And so utopia in Greek means nowhere. And it's an island where people get to the furthest point as they could in natural law. But everything they do, it logically follows, but it's brushing up against men's senses of liberty more. Even, and it puts himself in the dialogue to question the account from this traveler, Raphael Hythlodaeus. It basically means keeper of nonsense when you render out the Greek. And he's given this whole explanation of the utopians and their culture and things like that. And it's full of satires that come from the Greek poet Lucan, turning things on top of their head. They don't use gold. The only thing they use gold for is urinals and toilets because it's so worthless yet. But in real life, of course, you have to go with the prevailing notion of the world. So More's conception of the state is largely St. Augustine. It's city of God. Basically, coming out, there's the city of God and the city of man. And utopia is meant to make the point that if you're going to serve God, there is no city of man. We can merely get through the world. And it differs very sharply from the English notion of the commonwealth and republic, really, which is embodied in the notion of English law and English liberties, that we can have a good republic. And that's ultimately what the vision of government that's set forth under Henry is. We will have a godly republic with the godly king as head of our church. And that's where the direction is now taking. And so 1529, More opens up the parliament. They call this the Reformation Parliament. And so now Henry moves in action. There is a circle moving with Henry, fashioning ideas and policy that's motivating him forward. That's Anne Boleyn on the one hand, Thomas Cromwell on the other, and Anne Boleyn's chaplain, Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer is an interesting figure. He's an otherwise obscure, unimportant Cambridge don, had no attainable, achievements to his own, except that he had been the Boleyn family chaplain. Now that put him in a position close to Henry.
Didn't he have a wife too, a secret wife?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
His secret wife and go into other things. I mean, Cranmer is your perfect court archbishop because he'll do whatever. He burned people that believe the same things that he did because that's what Henry wanted, right?
Well, according to Cobbett, under King Henry, I'm assuming you read Cobbett's book,
yes,
but he said he burned people because they didn't believe in transubstantiation. Mm-hmm. But under King Edward, he burned people because they believed in transubstantiation.
Exactly. Precisely. And it didn't matter, whatever the king, and that's how Cranmer survives as long as he does. Right. And when it comes to his death is an unfortunate thing. It is really because of Queen Mary's trauma, because she sees Cranmer as the author of all the unhappiness of her life, of the divorce. She basically cites Cranmer as what caused all the misery in her life. And so she did not think that Cranmer was as spineless a creature as he was. And so she was surprised when he recanted and now declared himself a Catholic. And she's like, nah, not good enough. He's dying. And she burns him anyway. Against church law as well as civil law and everything, just declares him burned anyway. And that's part of it's the cathartic thing that she needs for her trauma in her life. Which is really brutal, really horrible, which would be another couple hours. So I was going to talk about Queen Mary. So, because of
that could be our sequel talk.
There we go. Yeah. The myth of Bloody Mary, we could call it, right? But in this one instance, she is unfortunately very bloodthirsty, but not in that sense. It's revenge. And Cranmer recants. She can't believe it. So she hasn't killed anybody. And if it weren't for that, if for her associating him with all the bad things that happened in her life, he might have survived that too. Who knows? But nevertheless, he's a spineless creature. But in the meantime, he goes to Henry and he says, you're doing this all wrong. Popes, legatine courts, dispensations. Henry, come on. Heart to heart here. You've read the Bible. I've read the Bible. What do we see in the Bible? I see kings. I see bishops. I don't see any popes. Do you see any popes? I don't see any popes. So why are we acting like the Pope has any authority to do anything? He's obviously just the Bishop of Rome. But you, by the ancient English prerogative, should be the head of the Church of England. And Henry's like, I don't know if Cranmer came up with that last bit, but somebody did. And Henry's like, I like that. I like the sound of that. That's where we're going to go. And that's the position they start moving on. So first that they attack the church. And so they come so the church comes into convocation with Wolsey gone. Archbishop Warham, very old fellow at this point. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury when Henry VII was king. So he's been there for a long time in Wolsey's shadow, unable to really do anything. Now he's taking up his full powers as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the primate of the English church. And they're getting to the serious business of reform. Henry's ministers all come and tell him, you are guilty of praemunire. What's praemunire? So this is what hitherto was a rather obscure English law, author of the time of Edward I. So if you're familiar with Braveheart, I'm sorry, but which I hate that movie, which at least is a coherent and good movie as movie, but I hate it for its historical inaccuracy. I really
yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so you get that. Edward I, and of course, Patrick Magoo is a great actor, but Edward I was about 6'5". He was the long shanks, really, 6'5", 6'7". He was huge. And equally as much as William Wallace, he was huge. Unlike Mel Gibson, but anyway, so he was huge, a huge bull of a man, and his temperament matched his size. He brooked no opposition. So he finds out Philip the Fair is taxing the churches for the war effort against him. So he decides to tax the churches. Now Philip the Fair had a concession from Pope Boniface VIII to do this. Edward I did not have any such dispensation. He was doing it anyway. So the Pope Boniface VIII tells him no. And Edward I tells him to piss off. And so Boniface VIII puts the whole kingdom under interdict. And interdict meaning full suspension of the church's sacramental life. No solemn baptisms, no Christian burial, no anything, sacraments only in danger of death. And Edward basically looks at the priests and the bishops and says, well, the Pope's all the way out there. And I'm here. And so are my men. Are you going to say Mass? Oh, yes, my liege. Of course we'll say Mass. They ignore the interdict. Now, some priests and bishops didn't like what was going on, so they make an appeal to the Pope against Edward's violation of the interdict. And so Edward has them arrested, and he has Parliament pass a new law, praemunire, which forbids any appeals across the sea to Rome against the king's act of governance. So, and this law comes to light because of a guy named Richard Hunn. Now, Richard Hunn is like the original Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself kind of figure. You see him referenced in Fox's Book of Martyrs, right? And like this big conspiracy theory that Fox puts out, which does have the appearance of truth. We'll admit, it really does. Richard Hunn sued the church because a priest had taken a baptismal garment from as a tithe because he didn't pay the tithe because he had a child that died. And so he sued the church to get this back. And so the church arrested him and put him in prison for heresy. And then he hanged himself in the prison. And so then the rumor that the church had murdered him came, and there was a big, theory swirling around about it. Thomas More investigated it very closely. He came to the determination that Richard Hunn had actually killed himself. He was present at the trial, and he notes the contradictions of the witnesses trying to claim he was murdered and whatnot. Be all that as it may, the coroner's jury comes out with a verdict of murder, and then accuses the bishop and his chaplain of the crime of praemunire. They go hunting the statute books to find a crime to charge the church with and violate the church's independence. They come up with praemunire. And so this case gets fought even in the presence of the king. And so this is how it's brought to Henry's attention. And when Henry sees that, he realizes the implications of the law of praemunire are that, basically he owns all the church's wealth because he can take it and then forbid appeals across the sea to Rome as a proper act of his jurisdiction as an ancient English liberty. So he and this is like in the 1524, if I'm not mistaken, the Richard Hunn trial. Maybe it's earlier than that. It drags on for a long time. It starts a lot earlier than that. But when this decision comes in, so Henry kind of puts a pin in it, holds on to that for later. Now he's taken that pin out. Praemunire. You accepted Cardinal Wolsey's authority from the Pope a latere. Therefore, you violated praemunire. Never mind the fact that Henry foisted Wolsey's authority on them. Yes. Never mind the fact that what would have happened to any of them if they resisted Wolsey's authority. Never mind any of that. They're all guilty. and their lives are forfeit unless they pay the crown 30,000 pounds. Well, the clergy is terrified, with the exception, of course, of St. John Fisher. And Fisher counsels resistance. Warham is, and because they hesitated, they finally agreed to it. And then Henry says, well, the clergy were easy. There was like pushovers. I would have been in trouble if they resisted this thing. And so he goes on and says, no, 100,000, 100,000, or you're all like forfeit of your sees and you'll all go to prison. Nobody stopped to think, wait, is he going to arrest all of us? If they all resisted, said no. So he demanded, this money and that they accord him the title of head of the Church of England. And Warham doesn't know what to do. He's an old man. He's afraid he's seen Henry since he was a boy. He knows what kind of man Henry is. He knows that Henry could kill him. And so he decides to give in. And it's Fisher that actually saves the day. Fisher says, well, there's perhaps a compromise we can do here. We give him the title, Praetor Legum Christi Permittat. So far as the law of Christ allows. We'll say head of the church so far as. The proviso, meaning if you're a Catholic, well, the law of Christ does not allow you to claim the title head of the church in earnest, because you're not, but only as far as it allows, will allow that. So Henry at first was kind of ticked about it, but then, all right, we'll take that. So convocation and
good enough for now.
Good enough for now. Legislation starts going through forbidding, basically encroaching on the independence of the church and papal authority by degrees, further and further. And the Archbishop Warham consecrates a bishop. Henry threatens to arrest him for praemunire, and then now Warham suddenly gets a spine, and he says, "Well, that's the very thing for which Thomas of Canterbury, that is St. Thomas Becket, died for. I'm not giving that up." No. And so it was too little, too late. He dies a month later, and Henry had been in negotiations with the Pope for various things. And so there's like an Indian summer of good relations with the papacy. And he then asks the Pope to approve his choice of archbishop, one Thomas Cranmer. And the Pope approves it. And so Cranmer is then made the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they get to work. And so then at some point, Anne has, she had declared in 1526 that Henry had her heart in her mind, but body, of course, would have to wait until they were married. Well, at some point, she gave up on the body thing too. And so she was now pregnant. So Cranmer had to work this together. So he, puts through this marriage, formally declaring that the marriage between Henry and Catherine is invalid by his authority as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that the marriage between Henry and Anne is valid. And done deal. And so just in time, so that when everyone tries to work out the time when the baby's born, it's not going to make obvious what went on. So the consequent then is that they need to, this happens, and then Catherine is then kind of put in like a sort of house arrest. And Thomas More observed he'd resigned the chancellorship before it got to this point because he said, I just can't have anything more to do with this. And so Henry announces the coronation of Queen Anne, who's universally hated by the London populace, I might add. Protestant or Catholic, doesn't matter. She's universally hated. She's thought to be a witch who has cast a spell on the king. Henry himself comes to that view later in the 1540s. He starts to wonder if Anne wasn't actually a witch that had put a spell on him, right? And as much as I want to say bad things about her, there's no contemporary evidence that was the case, that she was involved in any witchcraft. It's more buyer's remorse, I believe, on Henry's part for this whole affair. So be that all that as it may, More gets the summons, the invitation to Anne's coronation, and he says, he says to his daughter Meg, mark my words, they'll be confirming this with oaths. 1533, they come out with the Act of Succession, which declares, and there's other stuff that goes on in the background, which we've gone on so long, but the Act of Succession declares that the king's issue shall, between him and Anne, shall be the true inheritors of the crown imperial. Easy enough. If Fisher and More are brought out to swear to it because they've been the biggest opponents all this time. In the meanwhile, at least until the time where Henry finally married Anne, he had been writing tracts and books, in defense of the marriage to Catherine. More had been active in different fields quietly behind the scenes. And like I said, he eventually gets out of it. They tried to kill Fisher twice, once by poisoning, once by firing a cannon into his library at Cambridge, from the Boleyn apartments, which faced it, I might add. So
yeah, they talk about that in the Reynolds biography.
yes, they do. And so Fisher had been attainted on one occasion, and so they had gone through. And this is an interesting with Fisher, which again makes it very difficult for them to attack him, because he's not your corrupt bishop, guilty of pluralities, living high in the hog while the people suffer. He is, a true shepherd amongst his flock. He preaches to the people. He's going into average people's houses to give them the sacraments as a bishop when he could send anyone else to do it. He's making sure and all his priests are provided for. He's given all the support he needs for the church. He's giving alms himself in person, outside their residence. And they go into his residence when he's attainted. And Cromwell's men add the adjective old to every one of Fisher's possessions. The only things that they don't describe as old and in poor order are the chapel and the servants' beds. The servants all have new beds. Fisher's bed is horribly old. They wonder how anyone could sleep on it. There's old silks that have holes in them, and then there's diverse medicines and homeopathics and such that Fisher had concocted for himself for his health, and things of that sort. And those are the things they describe. And so everything is described as old. There's one thing that's on the altar, a St. John's head. St. John's head would be some kind of statuary representation of the severed head of St. John the Baptist. And remember what he said, I'm willing to lay down my life like a new John the Baptist. Well, Henry's going to give him that chance, just like a Herod of old. So More is the only layman trotted out amongst all these bishops to swear this act of succession, because as Anne Boleyn felt the snub when he didn't show up to the coronation. Fisher is there, of course. Now, they're both willing to swear the act of succession because kings and parliaments will make their laws about who will succeed to the throne. But the preamble, they wouldn't swear. The preamble required you to swear that the marriage between Henry and Anne was valid, whereas that with Catherine was invalid. And that was basically, again, an attack on the authority of the church, an attack on the Pope, veiled and indirect. And so they couldn't do it. So they were sent off to the Tower to change their minds. And so thus begins, a year and a half where they're in the Tower. And then this process goes on. So in the meantime, you have change in Rome. Pope Paul III becomes Pope. And he, Cardinal Veronese now is Pope Paul III. And he decides this huge reforming program. And one of the things he wants to do is he wants to make Fisher a cardinal. One of the reasons to make Fisher a cardinal is, of course, because he's famous as a reforming bishop. He's one of the greatest theologians in Europe. And also, he's really worried about the fact that Henry's got him in jail. And he figures by making Fisher a cardinal, Henry won't dare kill him. Well, he gets that entirely wrong. As soon as Henry hears about it, he says, let the Pope send his hat when he will, but he'll have to wear it on his shoulders. So they work really hard interrogating Fisher, interrogating More. And if we were doing anything on Thomas More, I'd go into much more on Thomas More. I don't have the time. But and so eventually they just can't get anywhere. And so finally it comes down to, they need a new law. And they write a law basically to address the issue of Fisher and More, which is the Act of Royal Supremacy. So which puts into law this whole business that Henry is the head of the Ecclesia Anglicana, who rejects the Pope's pretended supremacy over the Church of England, and declares that anyone who maliciously thinks against this supremacy is guilty of high treason. It's basically thought crime. That's what it comes down to. It is a very image of the modern state right there. Now, Henry does all of this with the color of law. Henry rules through Parliament, even though he probably considers himself an absolute monarch in the mold later. I mean, he is an absolute monarch, but he's careful about how he does it. So he's doing it with the traditional liberties of Englishmen in mind, with Parliament, no matter how much he has to rig the parliaments in the background through Cromwell or others. And so, but he does it all with the color of law. And the Act of Royal Supremacy is passed through Parliament, given the royal assent. And so, and there it is. And so then they work on catching Fisher and More in some statements. Still can't do it. So that's when Richard Rich is introduced, and he goes to Fisher, saying that he's the king's trusty servant, and just the king. This won't be used against you at all. The king just wants to know your actual opinion on it. So Fisher opens up to him, just assuming the goodwill, and he swears on an oath and everything. Well, nobody would violate that, would he? And Fisher finds out very quickly. He's dragged to trial the next day, and Richard Rich shows up to testify against him. He says, "But you swore on an oath that this wouldn't be used against me." And they say, "What of it?" And that's what Cavendish is.
I lied. There you go.
And then, so then he tries the same thing with Moore. Moore is smarter. Moore doesn't give.
He saw what happened to Fisher, probably.
I don't think he knew, but he knew enough. He knew Richard Rich well enough. Richard Rich, again, like Cranmer, very spineless figure, right? So he's fully on. He gets his rewards, right? Under Edward, he was full out Calvinist, supports Edward VI 100%. Under Queen Mary, he gets the biggest set of rosary beads that you can get, like carries around like a wall rosary, basically. What we today would have like as a wall rosary, as a decoration. He carries that around to show how pious he is as a Catholic. He reports on people that he knows to be Protestant, on his neighbors, tries to turn them over to the authorities so they get burned. So he'll be the guy, it looks like, who will stand out as supporting the regime. Elizabeth comes to the throne, reimposes the act of royal supremacy. Rich goes right back to being a Protestant. He dies in about 1560.
Chuck those rosaries. Yeah.
Yep, chuck that as fast as he could into the fire, and then he's a Protestant again for 50 and dies in 1563. So he manages to survive all these upheavals. But anyway, so he gives them what they need for more. So Fisher's trial, he's condemned, and so he's taken to the scaffold, and very contrary to that stupid HBO series, poorly acted. Decently written, poorly acted, in whoever they get for Fisher is like this big plump cleric. Fisher was like a skeleton. People decried this, that he's been. Now, Henry had commuted the traitor's death from hanging, drawing, and quartering down to just being beheaded. But when they stripped Fisher bare, people gasped because he looked like a skeleton. He'd been in the tower for like a year and a half without very much support. So,
well, if you see
those
the paintings of him, his cheeks are like sucked in, and
that's just from his own fasting in life. And now, especially, people decry, they say that if an old man like this had committed some crime in the Ottoman Empire, the great Turk himself the Sultan would have mercy on him and send him on his way, rather than put such a man in such a condition to death. But not so our merciful king. That's what and so he's put to death. He declares that he's dying for his faith in the Holy Roman Church and in the unity of the church, and he prays that God will give the king a good counsel. And then he's put to death. More again, he utters the famous line, that he's the king's good servant, but God's first, which is the very thing Henry taught him to do. When, according to Roper's account, when he became a royal counselor. So
well, and so they got Thomas. So explain how they got Thomas More, because
they get Thomas. So Richard Rich does this whole business with Thomas More, and Thomas More refuses to give him any direct answer. So he tries to be as vague as possible, and he simply, because he pesters him, he says, "Well, the royal supremacy is like a double-edged sword. If one man say one way, he loses body, but the other, he loses his soul." And Cranmer is agonizing over that. And he's like, it doesn't matter if it's not enough. We're just going to go with it. And so then at his trial, of course, it was a foregone conclusion, what the verdict would be.
Kangaroo court.
But then, but he's condemned. And so once he's condemned, then More opens his mind. And he gives this impassioned, very moving speech that even the judges in Norfolk, who was a friend of Moore's, hated being put in this position where he had to condemn More. More declares that neither the king nor Parliament can take this title, the head of the church, because that title has been given to the Pope by our fathers and our fathers before them, even before England was England. Parliament simply does not have the authority to author such a law. And so, oddly, the Lord High Chancellor is to come up with a good bit of English legal positivism, and it simply says, well, the law is what the King and Parliament says it is. And because he has to save the situation a little bit. And that's essentially how it goes. And then again, human positive law. You look at modern laws, you look at American positive law, runs roughshod over common law, or any notion of natural law. None of that's admissible in an American court. I mean, you had some judges will base things on common law and things of that sort, but ultimately, American positive law is what you have, at least in this country, and that's very much in the image of what Henry did that day, or what his judges did that day in condemning more. So this some people call this the first Brexit, right? And so in a certain sense, it is. England leaves the unity of European Christendom, and then it continues. So what Henry's essentially created now is a schism where there's a church with valid sacraments, and Henry's unwilling to go the full Monty. Cranmer and Cromwell are always working on him in different ways. Well, get rid of the mass, just replace it with a communion service. And Henry wavers. The idea that Henry is just trying to keep the church Catholic without a pope is nonsense. Henry wanted the church in his own image. Whatever he liked is what the church would use. Now, he liked the mass, he liked the chants, he liked the music, so he kept it. He let Cranmer have his experiment with English polyphony, and some of that's actually very good, by the way. And it's written by Thomas Tallis, ultimately. He was the one he was a monk that was turned out with the suppression of the monasteries. So he ends up in royal service. So he's writing English church music now for Henry to try to appease Cranmer. Even that's not enough. Cranmer wants all this stuff gone, all the ceremony gone. But he knew exactly when to stop. When Henry would react, no, I don't want to do that, he'd stop. So England, so the Henrician schism, the Henrician church, is a schismatic church, which is its fundamental doctrines being denial of the Pope, and even going as far as to declare the Pope the Antichrist. This puts them in a bit of a difficult situation. Like they said, they got to blame things on other people. So the King's book on the Seven Sacraments is blamed on Fisher. And even though when you read the two, that's obvious Fisher didn't write it. It's obviously the work of a well-learned layman. It differs. The arguments are not the arguments of a professional theologian. The writing style is not that it doesn't match Fisher's writing style at all. And it's clearly Henry's work.
So in terms of like the whole Henrician schism, say you're a Christian in England in 1540 or 1545,
right?
Would you say, oh, I'm a Catholic. Yeah, the Pope and the King are fighting, but they don't see their faith as any different? Or had they known that a big change had happened?
Until the suppression of the monasteries, that's what would happen. But the suppression of the monasteries, that's the first major change that takes place, whereby people say, oh, something's different now. We didn't catch it before, but this is more than just an issue with the Pope and the King. So, and thus you get the Pilgrimage of Grace, right? This big revolt against him. Now, monasteries have been suppressed. Wolsey had suppressed some monasteries. You might have a large monastic endowment, but only a handful of religious there, and so it would just be subsumed into some other order. That had happened, but this was a wholesale suppression all around, and it destroyed a lot of the infrastructure that supported the poor and educated the poor and helped people in hard times, like a lot. And now it's all being squandered amongst Henry's favorites and taken by minor nobility. And down in London, all the wealth from that, Henry's taken the bricks from various monasteries to build fortifications on the coast to possibly repel a potential invasion, whether from the French or from the Empire. All these things, now people recognize something's different. That's why you have the Pilgrimage of Grace. It's huge uprising. And, which now for the first time since the War of the Roses, the largest army in England is not the king. So Henry has to lie. He's subterfuge to get them to disperse. And then he gradually kills the ringleaders one by one. So and with that, people kind of get in for the long haul, like, all right. And there were people that thought that the whole action was wrong altogether, remained staunchly Catholic. Princess Mary tried for as long as she could, but then it happens with Anne Boleyn's fall, where it's basically put to her, you have to swear the royal supremacy or we're going to kill you, and the emperor will not save you. And so she does. It breaks her own conscience to swear the act of royal supremacy, and she never forgave herself. It was a huge thing she grieved over for years, the denial of her own mother's marriage to Henry. And that's, again, the part of the trauma, apart from being beaten by Anne Boleyn's servants when she was just made to be a regular commoner in the household to Princess Elizabeth. And the all these things adding, and then the trauma she'll then have under Edward, right? All these things add to the complications of her reign. So and again, like I said, that's its own episode altogether, talking about Queen Mary. But yeah, so it's ultimately it is a schismatic church, and with false doctrines. And then you have Edward. I mean, we talked about Henry too, just to kind of lay the quick end on Henry. So obviously, he's married to Anne. Doesn't work so well with Anne. Anne does not make the transition from royal mistress to queen. Queens are expected to behave in certain ways. They're expected to be subservient, to have no will about their husbands. Anne is just as headstrong and just as fiery as she was before. I mean, it doesn't work out. So she and Henry are arguing. She's pregnant with twin boys. Henry has an accident in a joust and is knocked off his horse, and he blacks out for 6 hours. And the horse lands on top of him too, in full plate armor, fully armored horse, lands on top of you. It's the equivalent of a car accident, really bad one.
Yeah,
and so Henry blacks out and he wakes up later in the day, right? And Anne thought he was dead. So she was terrified, and this strain caused her to miscarry with twin boys. And so then she's pregnant again, and she has a girl, Elizabeth. And now Henry's soured on the whole thing. How am I cursed again? So he eventually starts looking around for mistresses, and he finds one, Jane Seymour. So now Nicholas Carew, the groom of the stool, who had been a friend of Henry's for a long time, he ends up, seeing a chance. He doesn't like the whole Henrician schism. He wants a way to heal it. He knows Jane Seymour to be a good Catholic, part of, that is in favor of the old religion. So so he counsels her to do exactly what Anne did, to tell Henry no. Again, and to play up the romantic, because Henry's a romantic at heart. So it plays up the romantic feelings that Henry has, strokes up the interest and the excitement. Meanwhile, it's getting more tumultuous with Anne, to the point where him and Anne get in a drop-down argument in the bedchamber. The royal bedchamber is a public place, not a private place, like the name would imply, even though somewhat counterintuitive. So amidst various functionaries of the court, Anne accuses Henry of being no good in bed. And he's not going to take that lying down. So it's not terribly long after that Anne's brother George, the aforementioned Thomas Wyatt, a bunch of people are all arrested for having adulterous relations with Anne. And Anne is alleged to have had incestuous relations with her own brother. It's almost certainly trumped up charges. It's almost certainly not true, as bad as Anne might be in other respects. So then Anne is then arrested for treason. Now, it looks unfair. It is unfair, but it's also recognition of reality. So for a king to, have his indiscretions, as it were, it's considered, kings, hey, an official. I mean, they can recognize a bastard that comes from them and whatever. They're still a bastard. They're not an heir. But if you don't know who the issue is from the queen, there's a problem for the succession. So that's why now adultery in a queen is treason, whereas in a king, it's like, well, because it does throw the succession into question. Who's coming from the queen versus, what issues from the queen's private affairs somewhere else for the kings. So that's why it's adultery in a queen is treason. And so that's why because there's no possibility of another divorce. There's no way you're going to do that after the fight to marry Anne to begin with. It's just not going to work. So now it becomes all these trumped up charges of adultery and everything. Anne is beheaded, and the next day Henry marries Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour is the good wife. She's the wife that gives Henry his son, Edward. And so even later on, when Henry's married later, because what happens is, of course, Jane Seymour, she's the good wife. Right. She gives birth to the son, Edward, and of course, she dies shortly thereafter from an infection that she would have contracted. And it's it's a very sad and unfortunate thing. But it also meant that Jane didn't have a chance to offend Henry, and therefore didn't have the chance to be executed by him. Right.
So, wait, just pause for a second. You said Jane was a Catholic?
She was, and as much as she adhered to the old religion, and of course, this highlights too the change that had come about. So Jane Seymour is sympathetic to the old religion. She's still a Catholic. She's still, adheres to the Pope and whatnot. And she, she is, let's see. Henry's actual wife, Catherine, is dead.
Yeah.
And then, his pretend wife, Anne, is executed for treason. It's done by Henry and everything, but it's, she's dead. So, Henry's real wife is gone. His fake wife is gone. So, he's free to do what he wants. And so now he's married Jane, which, he's free to do. And so, hey, why not? And it's kind of like that. Why not rejoin the church? There's nothing stopping Henry from rejoining the church, but he doesn't do it because he's got too much power. You see, he's got too much power by being head of the English church, this whole schism, so there's no motivation, even though he could fully rejoin the church because the whole, cause of his excommunication was, putting away his real wife and marrying a fake one. So here's a portrait. Let's see.
Ryan, there's something added here.
Yeah, can you put it up? I just shared the screen. There we go.
Okay.
So this portrait is from later. Henry was actually married to his last wife, Catherine Parr, when this portrait was done up. And so it depicts his father and his mother, Elizabeth of York, in the background. And it depicts Henry flanked by Jane Seymour. Now, she'd been dead for a good 7-8 years when this portrait was done. And he's married to somebody else. So why didn't he put Catherine Parr there? It's because Jane Seymour is the good wife. She died at exactly the right time for her to be immemorialized by Henry as the queen who gave him his son at last. And of course, this actually gives, let's see, the whole raison d'etre of the Reformation, the inscription there, I can't read it directly. Let's see, trying to find, you see, I have a PowerPoint that's got all this broken down, but the Latin that's on the inscription basically says, who is the greater? Henry VII ended civil war, namely ended the War of the Roses, ended civil war, brought peace to the kingdom, but his son ended essentially saying ended the tyranny of the pretended authority of the Pope and restored true religion to England, more or less. I'm just summarizing from memories. I can't get a good enough picture to pull up the Latin, but that's essentially what. So it's a testament not just to Jane Seymour as the good wife, but to the Reformation and England as being Henry's crowning work. And of course, if Henry had died in 1525 after Charles V told him to stuff it in terms of partitioning France, he would have been yet another English king that tried to make England great again, and wasn't able to do so. I mean, because his idol was Henry V. He wanted to kick off the 100 Years' War again, but he lacked the resources to do it. And instead, he made England's mark by making it Protestant. That's how he views it, and that's also, of course, how successive generations will view it, because, of course, the victors write the history books. And so that's how they look at it. But he also set up a model that other kings wanted to ape in as much as their control of the church. So, so that's how the English Reformation, through this accident, namely that, the complicated politics, Henry's marital problems, and so many things, is born, the Anglican Church. So the quick end of Henry, of course, is that Jane Seymour dies, like I mentioned. They try to make a marriage with a German house, and so he marries Anne of Cleves. But when she gets to England, he doesn't like her. We don't exactly know why. But whatever reason, he takes a set against her, doesn't like her, so they have it annulled for non-consummation. Later, he married...
Well, and that's how something to do with Cromwell's death, right?
Yes, so Cromwell is the one who set all that up. And so Cromwell runs into the same problem that Wolsey did. He's a commoner and an upstart holding more power than what any commoner should. More held his position with dignity and grace, so he didn't offend the old guard or the aristocracy, but Wolsey and Cromwell both did. So they had enemies. And so Cromwell made a ton of enemies when he starts manipulating the supporters of Queen Mary. And like I mentioned, Nicholas Carew, Henry eventually sends to execution because they're trying to manipulate Cromwell, but Cromwell is a far more intelligent actor. He manipulates the side supporting Queen Mary, into committing themselves too much. And so now he's got all the evidence against them. And that's how he's then able to isolate Queen Mary and say, all right, you're Princess Mary, and say, all right, you're going to swear the royal supremacy or else. And all your friends are going to die. Some of them die anyway. And so, but that left a bad taste. And so people were waiting. So when the Cleves marriage fails, which Cromwell had set up, he sends Holbein to Germany to make portraits of these royal ladies. And Anne was the one that seemed the most pleasing to Henry. And so Cromwell had insisted on it, pushed it. He was going to make it like the prominence of his position, based on having set Henry up. And then Henry doesn't like her. And so all the voices, all his enemies start whispering against him, and Henry puts him to death, which he repents of a couple years, not even a year later, because he recognized how essential Cromwell was to his administration. And so as we lamented of it, he wished he could have not done it. But,
a very good lackey.
He does it. And so then he marries Catherine Howard, very young and very pretty.
Wait, I'm curious, is it okay if I take this off the screen, or do you still need this?
No, we're done with that.
Okay. All right. Yep. So Catherine Howard. Yep.
So he marries Catherine Howard, and Cranmer discovers very quickly she's a woman with a past. So and of course, she's a relation of Anne Boleyn, and Thomas Howard had put her forward, and so in her household. The best way to describe it is the key to the lady's bedchamber was liberally kept. And she had quite a number of sexual liaisons before marrying Henry. And she was a party girl. And but then she continued several of them while she was queen. Again, adultery in a queen. So she's put to death. It was a very hard thing for Henry to do because he really liked her. She's pretty, and well, there it was. So he just swore off marriage altogether. And then I can't remember who introduced the idea, but Catherine Parr was a widow, and she had a better sense of how to handle a man such as Henry, so she was married to Henry. She provides the benefit of having restarted Mary and Elizabeth's education, which had been kind of ignored for a long time, although she's also very Protestant, and so she sets kind of a more Protestant course. Henry dies in 1545. And so everything kind of continues, right? Henry's got these plans for this great funerary monument. Most of it he takes. So he has a sarcophagus that he took from Cardinal Wolsey. It was made by an Italian sculptor. And of course, Wolsey meant it for him. And so Henry takes the sarcophagus. He's going to use it for him, right? And then, he's got these massive, huge candlesticks that he wants to adorn this huge funerary monument, which have an equestrian statue in bronze, right? But when he dies, the problem is Cranmer needs all the money. He has the bronze melted down. He takes, all the other things planned for this funerary monument. And of course, Henry had paid a good deal of money to have masses said for his soul in perpetuity. Well, Cranmer doesn't believe in mass or the value of masses being offered for the dead. So he takes all the money and stops all the masses, even before the Book of Common Prayer. So there's Henry. That's what Henry gets for this whole business. Interestingly, the fate of all these things, the candlesticks are still around 100 years later. In the aftermath of the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, a slight relation of Thomas Cromwell, he has them sold, and now they're in a high altar in a church in Bruges, in Belgium. The sarcophagus, though, stayed in a kind of in like a storage somewhere in like royal holdings. So, but it was a beautiful thing. Nobody quite knew what to do with it. So then, after Trafalgar, they forgot for a minute Lord Horatio Nelson's bigamy and the fact he was a detestable person personally, and instead looking again dies at just the right moment, a heroic moment at Trafalgar, again making sure Napoleon can't invade, and so he's given this hero's burial. And so what did they use for his tomb? Henry VIII's sarcophagus, which was taken from Wolsey. And now you can see that tomb, which has Lord Horatio Nelson's body, in the crypt at St. Paul's in London. That's where it is today.
Really?
So if you've been there, you have seen it, just didn't know it was originally meant for Henry and originally meant for Wolsey.
I've never been to England except transferring flights in Heathrow, unfortunately. But I'd like to go there. There's so much Catholic history there. So yeah, so I think we've gone to the end of Henry VIII's life. That's probably a good place to stop. You know,
probably a good place to stop because there's another 3 hours for Edward and Mary and Elizabeth.
And Mary. Yeah, that's the sequel. No, I'd love to have you back on. You know, of course, when you have time. I know you're a bit busy guy with several children, and but no, thank you so much for coming on. Just a couple questions. Do you have any recommended books on this topic for our audience?
There's a good number. If you can find it, I'm waiting to manage the copyright on it and find the estate, but to get it back into print. But Father Philip Hughes, he was a Catholic priest. He was a great English historian, proper historian, as well as Catholic priest, and a Reformation era historian. So he wrote a book. I mean, he's written a number of books on this subject. There's the English Reformation. It's a 3-part volume. Some of it's dry and difficult to get through. There's a lot of figures, a lot of tables. They're all important stuff that otherwise you'd be hunting for in archives. So that's one of its values, as well as a lot of good narrative information and history on these different periods, and Henry's period, Edward and Mary, and then Elizabeth. He also wrote Popular History of the Reformation. I do highly recommend that one, along with Rome and the Counter-Reformation in England. I actually sell that book, so if you want a good picture from Mary and why the Counter-Reformation fails in England, through Elizabeth and kind of its death throes going down into Charles the First time. Then there's let's see, Diarmaid MacCulloch has a kind of a standard text on the Reformation that is good as far as it goes from professional popular historians. He's not Catholic, but it's a useful book for just having a lot of information in it. I'd recommend Dr. David Starkey, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, is a good book in that vein. Alison Weir, also another good historian. Those are all secular historians, Starkey and Weir.
Have you read this one?
Yes. So stripping it, I was going to get down to more Catholic sources. So Eamon Duffy, frankly, all of his books are books you want to read on this period. Stripping of the Altars is an excellent one, for getting a sense of what religious life really was like in England prior to the different phases of the English Reformation, a lot of which we didn't really get into, unfortunately, just time and got so much information to give out. But anything from Eamon Duffy, Fires of Faith is another one from him. And he's Catholic, but he's also a serious academic. And so he's writing as an academic, but with a mind to Catholic faith, but ultimately based on the sources.
And he's got a biography of Queen Mary.
Yeah, that's Fires of Faith.
Oh, really? That's the same one?
Unless that's a different book that I'm not familiar with, actually. There's another great book by Linda Porter. She's not Catholic, but she's an excellent historian, or at least she's not Catholic that I know of. And she wrote a book which originally was titled, at least the American title of it was The Myth of Bloody Mary. It might be in a different title now, but if you just do, did I say Elizabeth? Linda Porter. And Linda Porter, Mary the First. You should get her book. Again, excellent archival sources, excellent historical judgments. Just is really good at bringing out, so many of the issues. There's some actual books. If we come back again, and we're talking about Mary's reign, I'll talk a lot about the Habsburgs, the Habsburg rule in England. I touched on it a little bit with Charles V and things like that, but Philip's role in England is not merely just kind of sitting around being the royal stud to produce an heir, which is usually how it's depicted. He's actually de facto the king of England. And the Privy Council reports to him. The Privy Council reports to him. He's not just the royal stud to try to bring in an heir real quick. Even though it's all drawn up that, he doesn't have formal authority or hereditary right in England, just the same, who does the Privy Council report to? Philip. through translation, obviously, but because he only spoke Spanish, he didn't even speak Latin that well. But it's all really interesting stuff with the Habsburgs that I could, again, take us way far afield. I'm trying to think of more books. On the Scottish side, John Gee, Mary Queen of Scots, and again, Linda Porter's book, Crown of Thistles. That's another great book on Mary. If you want two good texts on Mary Queen of Scots that, again, are in the sources, but very sympathetic to her. Let's see. Then there is, and of course, there's Elizabeth, which, but I'm just keeping it more toward Henry. Richard Rex wrote a book on Henry VIII. That's a short, more popular style biography drawn by the sources. I'd recommend that one too. You look at that. Richard Rex, he's written a lot of books on St. John Fisher's theology and whatnot. But
is he Catholic or?
I don't know. I just know his book on Fisher's theology was very good and showed a mastery of Fisher's material. So, because I've read Fisher's material in Latin and then reading through Rex, I was like, you can tell when somebody knows what they're talking about versus when they don't. So,
well, you would know.
And that's why I recommend those. I'm trying to think as far as Thomas More. There's a book by there's the books that I sell, both on Fisher and More by E.E. Reynolds, which I do recommend. Again, good biographies, solid biographies. Yep. Then there's
is the biography by William Roper good?
That's it's good. It's a primary source material because as Roper was his son-in-law. Like I said, there's issues in his account that you got to, just in terms of the historiography that got to be worked out. Sometimes those are in notes. Other times you have to look in other treatments to kind of parse that out. John Guy, I can't remember how to say his name right. He's an English historian. He does a good job of showing where Roper really didn't understand the material he was working with, where it came to like Thomas More's, like in the law courts and things like that. He wrote a book, which I believe is out of print. It's called The Public Career of St. Thomas More. And then he has another one, A Daughter's Love, basically the life of Margaret Roper, that is Margaret More, Thomas More's daughter, and which has a lot of information on Thomas More. But there's another guy, is it Ackroyd? I think it's Richard Ackroyd, who wrote a biography on Thomas More that's also very good, even though he's a non-Catholic historian, and some of his judgments on More I actually don't agree with, but he has a lot of the primary source history at his fingertips to get a hold of. So there's just a ton of books, a ton of reading. I even scratched the surface on the reading, the studies.
I think you've given enough for
archaeology,
us to look into.
And sometimes you get lost, like in the British Library or the Bodleian or in places like that, just looking over the royal collections that are in manuscript that are digitized and reading these things. And Tudor paleography is not that hard to learn. A lot of it's tricky and to get. Sometimes you get an italic hand in there, so it's like reading cursive. Other times you get that complicated Tudor hand, like you read the original of Thomas More's own writings. Most people can't read it. And so I taught myself with the aid of a few books that were produced by English researchers for their paleography classes. And so I managed to get those books and just worked with it. Took a text I knew that I had in print, and then took the original from the whatever manuscript collection I had it digitized from. And so just kept practicing until I got it. Once you get the vowels, that's the biggest thing. And then certain letters that look like other ones, then you can work it out. Then that's largely how you work to get that kind of knowledge for the paleography.
So let me throw out a thesis. Like, I don't study too much in the 1500s. I'm more of like a medieval guy. Mm-hmm. And as someone who's Catholic, who grew up in a country where there's both French and English influence, the French are seen as the hardcore Catholics. The English are seen as the anti-Catholics. But if I study church history, it seems, although England did go Protestant, it seems like England was always a lot more Catholic than the French were. It seems that way. Do you agree with that, or?
As far as national policy up until the Reformation, I think that would be fair. In terms of the populace, I wouldn't say so. The very strong, very powerful, especially look at the French Wars of Religion. And, in those Catholic cities and Catholic villages and Catholic towns that resisted the Huguenots were very passionately, strongly Catholic. Now, did they know their catechism backwards and forwards? No. Did they, but they were passionately devoted to the Blessed Sacrament, passionately devoted to the Blessed Virgin, to the saints and the church festivals, and so had no tolerance or taste for the Huguenot, vandalism against the faith and church buildings and everything. I will put it this way: Catholicism, at least since the victory of Protestants, especially Elizabeth's time, most especially post gunpowder plot, which is a state contrived, at least permitted, if not formally created, false flag to stop the tide of sympathy and power for Catholics, in particular in England, and the ability for English Catholics to fight abroad for the Spanish and the Netherlands. And that was a huge national security risk they're trying to stop. That's why the whole gunpowder plot was contrived. And ever since then, being Catholic is synonymous with being treasonous. So as a result, in Anglo culture, being Catholic is always a second-class citizen, is always a keep your head down affair. Don't go too far here. And it moves along with the Anglo culture of tolerance that you see following the religious conflicts of the English that underpin the English Civil War, the Bishops' Wars, and even the Glorious Revolution, so-called. Still imbibes a lot of those conflicts. And the mood for an open-ended tolerance that now comes to the fore under William of Orange, that becomes the kind of the order of the day, as long as you're not too Catholic. And then we might still apply penal law if we want to, and especially to keep those Irish down. But ultimately, there's a notion of tolerance, and that becomes the mainstay of Anglo culture as such. Catholics very much drink from that and imbibe in that, because that's the tolerance that will allow them to gain acceptance in their Anglo society. Very different for Francophone society, which is very triumphantly Catholic, or conversely, very triumphantly Protestant, Huguenot, or conversely, very triumphantly Mason. There's no in-betweens. There's no half measures. There's no tolerations. You look at why did you have the Paris Commune? Why is atheism so hostile to Catholic faith in the later 19th century under the Second Empire, or as you go into the Third Republic? Why is it so hostile to the faith? Because you were 100% in on atheism, or you're 100% in on Masonry, you're 100% in on Huguenotism, or you're 100% in on Catholicism. There's no kind of, we'll all just get along in the French culture of those times. And even today, the French culture is still an all or nothing, experience, which is admirable for the culture. A French Mason will be far more passionate about being a Mason than most Americans are about whatever religion they are, and being part of the font of this very tolerant Anglo culture. And I say most. I don't mean every single person or exponent. We're all lily-livered, lax people. But the culture at large is that we subsist in. And what happens when someone's very passionate? Oh, he's too rigid. Oh, that's going too far. And that's the modern temperament's imbibed a lot of that, I would say.
Yeah, no, it seems that way. It seems that way amongst the French in Canada too. I mean, if you're a Catholic, you know who the Catholics are amongst the French Canadians. But that's interesting. I don't know a lot about France during the. I kind of know that France was. Was one of the players that made things possible for Martin Luther, because I know that Charles V was kind of always fighting a two-front war with Turks on one side and the French on the other.
Right.
And so he didn't really have the power to suppress it.
Like the Smalkaldic League, for example, was funded by the French. And they're very active as an active Protestant bloc resisting Charles V. Fast forward 100 years. During the 30 Years' War, Richelieu bet the farm by sending as much gold as he could to fund Gustavus Adolphus to come in and to make good on the Danish claims in the to various Protestant cities in the empire and the Protestant cause of various Lutheran cities. And he was an extremely effective. He was tried and true through the Polish-Lithuanian wars. Excellent soldier. And Richelieu almost bet too much. He almost created a very militant Protestant empire on his flank instead of a divided one like he wanted. And lucky he was saved. I forget which battle it was where Gustavus was killed. It's not coming to my mind right now because I haven't done much with the 30 Years' War in about a year or so. So I can't remember the battle, but Gustavus is killed during the battle. And then the Swedish claims for Protestant allegiance in Germany evaporate with him. Nobody's able to take his spot. But then the Catholic side is not strong enough to capitalize in the absence. And so, figures like Tilly and Wallenstein, none of them are strong enough to make good a united empire like they might have at the beginning of the conflict. And so, again, the French formally supported not formally, but they supported the Turks during different phases because that meant resisting the empire. Right. That didn't mean they were going to take up arms on behalf of the Turks against the empire, but they weren't going to do anything to help the empire either against the Turks. In 1683, for example.
Okay, but okay. At the same time, the amount of there was huge opposition to the Protestantization of England. Like, for example, we talked about the Pilgrimage of Grace. Right. There's also the Bigod Rebellion, and the Rising of the North.
Right. Under Elizabeth, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, that's a lot of opposition, like they fought tooth and nail. They had to make tens of thousands of martyrs to make it a Protestant nation.
We should probably save it for if I come back to do something on Elizabeth.
Okay. That I'm sure there's a lot of politics involved in that rebellion too. That, of course,
and a lack of coordination. And like with the Northern Rising, the Duke of Alba in the Netherlands, he's getting these reports, and the Pope's got these plans, and they're trying to get the Spanish to make effective these various adventurers that want to create these and Alba's just looking at these guys are chodes. They're like, they don't know how strategy works. It's one thing to say an army will appear, and another thing to make it happen, and they don't know how to make it happen. And so he kept the Spanish out of various things because he saw the absolute failure that was going to come from it, which he was largely right about for the most part. And the real time for the Spanish to step in was earlier on, and they didn't do it. And that's why they used to call Philip II the Protestants' best friend, because he didn't do anything when he had the opportunity to do something. But then again, that might cut. But again, this is like a conversation for another time. Because we're opening up rabbit holes that I foresee another 3-hour stream. So
we'll definitely have a sequel to this one when you have time. The sequel to Henry VIII. We'll call it that. So then we
go.
Edward, Mary, and if we have time, Queen Elizabeth.
I would say Elizabeth should be her own show.
Her own show? Okay. We got Edward and Mary. The I guess half siblings, you can call them.
Right.
All right. Is there anything else you want to say to my audience before I kill the stream?
No, just thank you for listening to me blab for a long time. So it was a great honor and a joy to talk about these issues, and and any support you're willing to give, to my press and in buying various books, for the, again, trying to recoup the tradition and for the glory of the Catholic faith.
Yeah, amen. Like I'll definitely buy more of your books. I plan on buying more of them. Like I've not started to read the stuff on John Fisher yet. I've only read the St. Robert Bellarmine stuff. Mm-hmm. So you'll have to tell me where to start with John Fisher.
Right.
So thanks, and I will kill the stream right now.